Chapter 11, Volume 1, Big Love. 1973, First Steps for Students, January. The year 1973 began quietly at Copan. Most of the students from the third course had left. Peter Kedge was in Dharamsala and an American, Dick Robinson, was now Copan manager. Marcel Bertels was on his way to meditate in retreat at Tushita until he reached enlightenment. Nick Rivish and Yeshi Kadro had finished their 1-week Lamrim retreats in the Sangha house and were living in Mummy Max's big old Rana house, traipsing up to Copan every day to help out in various ways. The first thing they did was organize the Copan library, such as it was, a haphazard collection of Zina's old books on theosophy and related topics, and books left at the monastery by other students. In those days, very little on Tibetan Buddhism was available in English. The library was located in Anne's house, the small one-room brick building just down from the office. Nick had written to many of his medical colleagues and drug companies in Australia requesting donations of medicines and equipment, the idea being to establish a free medical clinic for the Copan monks, local Nepalese villagers, and visiting Western students. Anna Ann was also around, but no longer living in her house, which was to become the home of the new clinic. Yeshi Kadro also assisted Lama Yeshi with his growing correspondence, and she and Nick started getting Copan organized for the upcoming 4th course in March 1973. In early January, Lama Zopa Rinpoche went to Bodh Gaya with Losang Nyima, Anna Ann, and Nawang Samten, Lama Zopa's sister, to attend Kyabji Ling Rinpoche's Guru Puja commentary and Yamantaka initiation. The day before the initiation, those in attendance were asked to check their dreams. Glenn Mullen knew nothing about Yamantaka, the wrathful buffalo-headed Buddha of wisdom, but that night he dreamed he was reading a book that caused countless mandalas to dissolve into him. During his dream, he thought to look for the name of the author of this book. Skipping to the colophon at the end, he read, "Composed by Lama Thubten Yeshi." It was like meeting him for the second time, recalled Glenn. In addition to attending Ling Rinpoche's teachings, several students from the 3rd Copan course, such as Marcel Bertels and Chris and Barbara Vaudier, also took a 10-day Vipassana course with Gonka at the Burmese Vihar. Piero was in Bodh Gaya as well. He had decided he didn't want to be a Getzel, a novice monk, but wanted a full ordination as Gelong instead. "I was proud," said Piero. "I thought Getzel ordination was for children." Lama Zopa Rinpoche relayed Piero's message to Lama Yeshi, who sent Marcel with this reply. "This time you become a Getzel and with Kyabji Ling Rinpoche. You are very fortunate." Thus, Piero, now Thubten Donyo, was ordained, becoming Lama's 3rd Western monk after James and Jampa Zangpo, and the first Italian to be ordained into the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Geshe Thubten Tashi was supposed to go from Laudo to Copan to teach the young Sherpa monks, but decided instead to go to Parping, the holy Vajrayogini place near Kathmandu, to do a 12-year retreat. So Lama Yeshi had to fill in as the boys' teacher. One of the things he did was to teach them how to chant. He had a very powerful chanting voice, although few were aware of its full range, because he rarely, if ever, demonstrated this gift to anyone. However, he did manage a quick trip to Bodh Gaya to attend some of Ling Rinpoche's teachings with Max, after which she returned to Copan via Sarnath, where he visited Geshe Jampa Techuk, who had moved there after finishing his retreat in Copan. On January 30th, Lama wrote to the Soliks, "Here at Copan, everything is okay. I am working with the Laudo monks with a strong, wrathful aspect in Thubten Zopa's absence. He is now in Bodh Gaya, and some students are arranging the next meditation course. It looks like we need much energy because we may have more than 100 students. I hope you realize that you need much inner communication to find inner wisdom, Mother Tara, don't you? The divine equality of Mother White Tara offers more strength and energy to you, both physically and mentally, than all New York's material and medicine. Now I have moved into the new Gompa on the date of the Western New Year. That was a fantastic day of elemental manifestation, which I checked up astrologically. Things seem to be going smoothly now due to those magnificent vibrations. Zena is still at Tubten Choling. Maybe in May or April I shall go to see her and take her daughter with me, because before she went to the mountains she made me promise to bring her daughter, and I don't wish to break my promise to another sentient being. The visit to Lumbini. After the Bodh Gaya teachings, Lama Zopa Rinpoche decided to go to Lumbini, the birthplace of the Buddha, on pilgrimage, and asked Piero to accompany him. He also wanted to visit the great Sakya Lama Chobgye Trichen Rinpoche, who lived there. Piero booked them into a cheap, dirty hotel room in nearby Bhairahawa, now called Siddharthanagar. The room was swarming with mosquitoes. Piero carefully hung a mosquito net for Rinpoche, but he just pushed it aside, saying, "Poor ones, they are so thirsty, we should help them." He spent the night sitting cross-legged on his bed, never lying down at all, with thousands of mosquitoes biting him. As they had very little money and could not afford to rent a car, Piero went to hire bicycles, but found only one available. "Why do we need two bikes?" asked Rinpoche. "I don't know how to ride." So tiny Rinpoche propped himself on tall Piero's bicycle handlebars. Both of them fell off several times. Once Rinpoche even landed on the ground cross-legged, said Piero. He just sat there. It was so funny. After a few days, they returned to Kopan. Lama Yeshe just couldn't do enough for the Ingis. Some French friends of Zena's who were staying in Kathmandu had visited him at Kopan for tea. On the day as they were leaving their hotel, waiting for a taxi, with their bags packed, Lama suddenly turned up in the hotel lobby to bid them farewell. Yet no one had told him where they were staying. When discussing this curious event later, each of them had different memories of what Lama Yeshe had said to them. "What is he, a Buddha?" they asked each other. Lama Pasong and Lama Lundrup. Kopan was growing. The number of people attending the meditation courses was doubling, and more local families wanted to send their sons to the lamas for a Buddhist education. Losang Nyima, Mummy Max, and Anna Ann were working as hard as they could, but Lama clearly needed more help. Pasong Sering and Lundrup Rigsel, Lama students from Buksa, had spent 2 years clearing land and helping to build Sera Monastery in South India. By 1973, they were back at their studies and had more or less adjusted to the new climate. These two had kept in contact with Tubten Yeshe. Pasong Sering had even written Lama a letter asking him to be his teacher. Now Lama Yeshe replied, "You and Lundrup Rigsel come immediately to Kopan. Zopa Rinpoche and I are making a school here. We have no time, so please come and teach the boys for us." Pasong Sering replied he would love to do so, but had no money. Lama Yeshe promptly sent him some. Lundrup Rigsel thought he might be able to teach the children the Tibetan alphabet. Monastic protocol demanded that monks ask permission to leave their monasteries. In December 1972, Lundrup Rigsel did so, but was refused. However, he got permission to attend Ling Rinpoche's Yamantaka teachings in Bodh Gaya, and managed to get his leave extended to include a 3-month stay at Kopan. He arrived there in early March. Pasong Sering sensibly waited until his abbot was away before asking permission of his deputy. "I didn't mention that I wanted to go to Nepal. Instead, I told him I needed to go to Dharamsala because I was sick and could get the medicine I needed there." A few months later, Lama Yeshe sorted things out and permission was granted for both monks to stay at Kopan. Lundrup Rigsel was born in Tibet in 1939, the only child of a woman who became a wandering nun. He was raised by his grandmother and entered Sarajay at the age of 13, where he proved to be an excellent debater. In 1959, he fled from the invading Chinese, finishing up in Assam, where he was forced to spend 9 months working on various road gangs before gaining a place at Buxa. By the time he arrived at Kopan, just a few months before Pasang Sering, Lundrup Rigsell had completed more than half the classes needed for his Geshe degree. Lama Lundrup Rigsell and Kopan fit each other perfectly. The little monks quickly came to love him like a mother, clinging to his robes, their tiny brown arms draped comfortably around his neck when he sat among them. Pasang Sering became the quintessential manager at Kopan. He oversaw everything practical and physical around the monastery, taking care of the road, the monastery vehicles, building and construction, maintenance, gardening, shopping, and anything else that needed doing. The fourth Kopan meditation course. The fourth course began March 18th. The all-inclusive cost for the full month was still only 300 rupees, which in those days was roughly equivalent to $45. Whereas 54 people had attended the third course, about 120 showed up for this one. Concerning the students who volunteered to help out by doing work at Kopan, Lama Yeshe's policy was that those who had money were expected to pay, while those who didn't received assistance from the Kopan office. Dick Robinson, Nick Ribish, and Yeshe Kadro worked around the clock between the courses, and Yeshe Kadro in the office and Nick helping to make Rinpoche's wish-fulfilling Golden Sun into a more comprehensive book. Once again, interested people, young and old, but mostly young, made their way up the track to Kopan Hill. Among them was Ursula Bernice. She had lived in Japan for some years, where she had purchased a very rare Shingon mala. Ursula knew a lot about such artifacts. Arriving in India and having read The Way of the White Clouds, she gave this mala to the very first monk she met. 1 week before the course started, Ursula arrived in Kopan. Mummy Max took her to meet Lama Yeshe. He was standing on the flat roof, and in his hands was my Japanese mala. I recognized it immediately. I later discovered Max had bought it for him, so I assumed the monk I gave it to must have sold it almost right away. I didn't say anything about it, though. I was too shy, said Ursula. Another good-sized crowd turned out for the course, leaving their hash pipes and Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young tapes packed away in various Kathmandu hotels. Among the new arrivals were 20 Australian friends of Nick Ribish, including his mother, Bee. Nick had been enormously changed by his experiences with the Lamas and had launched a campaign to persuade his friends to join him at Kopan. During his Lamrim retreat, he had bombarded many of them with enthusiastic letters. The first letter he wrote to his mother was 13 pages long. A few days later, he sent an 18-page one. It was hard to comprehend the change in him because he'd always been so hedonistic, said B. Ribish. I thought he was sunstruck or poisoned. Here he was imploring me to join him in Kopan, insisting I should check things out for myself. He claimed it was the only way he could possibly repay my kindness to him. I was worried. Most of Nick's friends in Melbourne and Brisbane knew each other. They swapped his letters and debated their contents. It all sounded rather appealing. Travel to the east was on their agenda anyway, so it wasn't too hard to imagine spending a month at Kopan. Little did these dope smokers and party-goers imagine then that Tibetan Buddhism would become established in Australia through their efforts and close links with one another. Initially, Nick's friends were rather shocked by his news and uncharacteristic piety. Nor did they fancy the trend among some of the more seasoned Kopan students to adopt the superficial trappings of the Tibetans, among whom they were living, dressing in chubas, raving about momos, Tibetan dumplings, swilling butter tea and exclaiming "Ale" like old Tibetans. B. Ribish sat in the back row of the Gompa. I didn't like it at first. The flies, the smells, and the food were all horrible. Nick told me to meet Lama Yeshe. Nick took me to meet Lama Yeshe when I arrived. He was so warm, young, and pleasant, but after a week I'd had enough. Nick and Marie went to great lengths to convince me to stay, which I did. I even began to listen, and the logic of what was being said began to penetrate. I started to identify with some of it, said B. During the course, one young woman became very emotionally attached to Lama Zopa. Her grandmother, an aristocratic and highly educated Englishwoman, came all the way to Nepal to ask these strange monks what they had done to make her granddaughter become so unstable. This young woman happened to be extremely wealthy. Were they kidnapping her? Ursula Bernice was on the flat roof with Lama Yeshe when the old lady marched up. She was furious. You could see that, said Ursula. Lama just beamed love at her, and before she could speak, he was murmuring, "Yes, dear, yes, dear." He put an apple in one of her hands and some cookies in the other. Suddenly, there was this formidable woman with both hands full and rendered speechless. Lama just completely won her over in 2 seconds. He explained to her that he was busy just now. Perhaps she might care to take tea with him, and they could talk later. She turned around and walked away, totally transformed. The woman even stayed on for the course. Lama Zopa taught the 4th Kopan meditation course in his usual rigorous style, concentrating on the basic Buddhist teachings on the purpose of being human, impermanence and death, suffering, refuge, and karma. He also taught on the 8 worldly concerns, also referred to as the 8 worldly dharmas. These especially sticky preoccupations are rooted in our mental afflictions of attachment, anger, and ignorance, and motivate us to commit negative actions, ultimately keeping us bound in the conditioning of samsara. They are presented in 4 pairs: attachment to receiving and possessing gifts and material things, aversion to not receiving or losing material things, attachment to having a good reputation and aversion to a bad reputation, attachment to praise and nice words and aversion to blame and criticism, attachment to pleasure and aversion to problems. Rinpoche explained the importance of giving up the 8 worldly concerns. Freedom from the 8 worldly concerns creates real peace, therefore we have to renounce them. Renunciation is a mental action arising from a decision. It is difficult, it is harder to change mental actions than physical ones. To do so requires a positive mind, and not allowing it to happen comes from the negative mind. Our problems are not the objects we encounter or the pleasures we experience, but the desires themselves, the mind. Suffering is created by the mind. We must know how this works beyond having just an intellectual understanding of it. Craving desires and other negative minds have caused us to be reborn continuously in the 6 realms of samsara since beginningless time. From the smallest animal to the biggest, from the beggar to the king, those who live lives are not focused on the practice of Dharma, are concerned only with present momentary problems, not with future suffering, and they lack understanding of the nature of suffering. Their greatest mistake is to always create the cause for greater sufferings while trying to stop or cure the temporary ones. They do not understand the nature of suffering or its cause. Therefore, they do not recognize true happiness. They try to stop temporal problems by applying temporal solutions, unaware that that is the actual cause to experience more problems in the future. How do we stop doing this? First, we have to recognize our mistakes. It is important to know this essential Dharma point. Temporal methods never help. If we check up, we will see that such methods only create the cause for the continual arising of future suffering. The reason for this is that these methods come from mostly following the 8 worldly concerns, from doing whatever the negative mind of greed wants. Greed is attached to the 8 temporal needs. All 8 can be seen in the light of greed. They all depend on greed and work for it, like servants working for a master. We are the same. Most of us have been working for greed. Check up your own actions, even now. Ask, what am I doing this action for? We can discover how to stop temporal problems by asking, is this what greed needs? The more we look, the more we will discover greed underlying our actions. The result of actions done with the 3 negative minds of greed, ignorance, and hatred is always suffering and problems. Greed is the creator of samsara. Love mixed with greed is love created by ignorance and causes us to remain in samsara. This love is not the same as real love, and its results have to be experienced in the 3 lower and 3 upper realms. Why doesn't it bring peace? Because the principal cause is the unsubdued, untamed mind. The root mind is confused, a wrong mind, because the 3 negative minds always see their object in the wrong way and not in the way it actually exists. They see their object in a way that the enlightened mind sees as false. Just as somebody with a dirty face can't expect to see a clean face in the mirror, it is impossible for peace to arise from those 3 negative minds. So all the problems we experience are their fault. All methods done out of greed for temporal needs are negative actions. We engage in such negative actions to try to solve the problems that were created by a previous life's karma. But that method of following the 8 worldly concerns causes problems in this and future lives. It is just a cycle. To stop that which was created by previous negative karma, we use a method similar to that used before, and so it continues. That method doesn't really take care of all temporal problems, the physical and mental sufferings. They are not completely ceased. Furthermore, this method creates negative karma, simply in order to take care of this life. One is creating the cause of suffering, creating bad karma to start bad karma, an impossible thing. This is no one's fault, but one will have to suffer in a future life, and so it always circles around. Buddha Dharma, the antidote to the 8 worldly concerns, has no definite form. Any action can be either Dharma or non-Dharma, eating, writing, playing, dancing, and so forth. No matter what it looks like, any action done without involvement of the 8 worldly concerns and with bodhicitta motivation is a Mahayana action, and any action done with attachment and greed for the 8 worldly concerns is a non-Dharma action. The method that avoids the 8 desires is a method to stop the continuity of bad karma and leads to freedom from suffering and to enlightenment. This is a perfect, true method. What makes an action Buddha Dharma? Positive actions avoid and oppose the 8 worldly concerns. They counter greed and attachment. Such actions create karma and bring happiness in this and future lives, human rebirths with better conditions and the opportunity to lead a Dharma life and achieve bodhicitta, perfect peace, and enlightenment. Oh my God, thought a married man who happened to be there with a young girlfriend. I've left my wife and children behind to come here with her. In an urgent interview with Lama Yeshe, he received only kindness and a wood block print of Tara. I thought I'd get a lecture, but he just explained to me that Tara's left leg was bent to signify she could control sexual energy. He gave me a mantra to say all the way home and told me everything would be all right. Every afternoon, Anna Ann led a discussion group during which she and Nick faced a daily barrage of crazy questions and criticisms of the place, and of the toilets in particular. These consisted of roughly constructed stalls with boards laid over a fairly ghastly long drop, for they had wonderful views of the Kathmandu Valley and the surrounding mountains. Lama Yeshe made use of them by planting tomatoes nearby. One hot day, B. Rivish, who was sitting in front of one of the big, low Gompa windows, suddenly fainted. Out of nowhere, Lama Yeshe appeared at the window, helped her up and out the window, walked her back to Mummy Max's little brick house where she was staying, gave her aspirin, rubbed her back, and generally pampered her for 2 hours. It was much more than I would have done, said Nick rather ruefully, and I was the doctor, and her son. When teaching, Lama Zopa never took much notice of time, and sometimes it seemed like he went on and on for hours. For many of those sitting in the Gompa, concepts like emptiness, bodhicitta, the hells, the hungry ghosts, great countless eons, and the concept of all sentient beings seemed strange. Understanding the teachings was definitely a challenge. Perhaps they were annoyed by poor Rinpoche's poor English and halting delivery. Maybe the subject was just too confusing. Whatever the reason, people started missing lectures. They sulked and complained until there was a real buildup of dissatisfaction. The usual cue for Lama Yeshe to come and give a talk. Everyone piled into the Gompa for it, including the slackers and dissenters. They waited and waited, but he never turned up. Instead, he sent Nick, who, seemingly empowered by Lama, did a fantastic job of bringing everyone together and ironing out the tension. Among those to whom Nick had sent letters were his friends Max Feldman and Max's partner Maggie. Maggie didn't like the meditation course at all. I was desperately unhappy and full of Catholic hang-ups. I went to see Lama, who told me, "Just have trust." It did help, although I often ran away to Kathmandu for the day. Somehow, I always bumped into Lama Yeshe there. I'd walk into a restaurant and he'd turn around and say, "Hello, dear," as though he was expecting me. Another time, he waved at me from across the street, and once he jumped right into my taxi as I was returning to Buddha. Obviously, I was not going to be able to escape this guy. There were 3 small children at the course, including Adam, the young son of Australians Bill and Gloria Searle. Lama always kept an eye on Adam, said Gloria. One day he told me to feed him meat, insisting that Adam needed it. I was impressed because Nick had said Lama knew a lot about Tibetan medicine. Sometimes Lama teased us, saying we should leave Adam with him at Mount Everest Center. One day he said to Adam in front of us, "You must take care of yourself, Adam. You are reckless." He was very serious. Chris and Lisa Kolb returned to Kopan with their small son, Tor. They were expecting a second child by this time. Despite all this, I was now sure I wanted to be a monk, said Chris. Lama Yeshe even offered to ordain me. Lisa wasn't too happy about it, and everyone else thought I was nuts, but the feeling just got stronger and stronger. It was around that time that I realized Lama Yeshe was free, that he didn't ever need to smoke dope or take acid, because when he got up every morning he was already exactly as high as he could get. One young Australian man had a very personal encounter with Lama Yeshe. For 10 days I became what is known as priapic. I had an erection that simply would not go away. It was painful, bewildering, and embarrassing. I had to leap out of my sleeping bag in the freezing cold to ejaculate uncontrollably. There was no one I could talk to about it, so I decided to try Lama Yeshe. I started hanging around where he was supervising the young monks, carting rocks for the next building project. He always beamed and said hello and asked how I was, so I decided to tell him. "Are you thinking of someone in particular, dear?" he asked. I lied and said I wasn't. He then adopted a very campy posture, hands to the side of his cheek, eyelashes fluttering, as he said in this very coquettish voice, "Oh, really?" But I wouldn't admit it. He dropped the pose, rolled his eyes, and said in a weary voice, "You look for the answer within, dear." A few days later, I was sitting under the Bodhi tree in front of the Gompa, feeling utterly wretched when I felt a tap on my head. I looked up to see Lama mincing past. He looked over his shoulder, winked at my crotch, and said, "Still in the lower chakras, dear?" Then he walked off, chanting the Guru Shakyamuni mantra in staccato. Tayata Om Muni Muni Maha Muni Yasoha. Control, 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 great control. All the while looking first over his right shoulder, then the left with each silly step. I thought, thanks a lot, pal, but that night the problem passed. 108 people completed the 4th Kopan course, and for once everyone paid. This is an auspicious number relating to the 108 volumes of the Kangyur. There is a popular Tibetan Buddhist prayer entitled 108 Verses in Praise of Great Compassion, and there are also commonly 108 beads on a Buddhist mala. Near the end of the course, Lama Yeshe gave a talk on refuge and precepts, which left everybody weak with laughter and filled with enthusiasm for living a different kind of life. As usual, a number of those in attendance opted not to take the precept, to abstain from taking intoxicants. Hash was still just too much fun for some. From Lama Yeshe's talk on the lay precepts at the 4th course. There are some people here who want to take the 5 precepts. Ordination is beneficial for oneself and for sentient beings. The Lama's experience is that before taking and giving these precepts, we should have some understanding of what they are and why we take them. It is not just a samsaric custom. We all want perfect peace, happiness, everlasting satisfaction, and liberation. Since that's our goal, we should head in that direction. Otherwise, we're just hypocrites. We say we want, but act completely opposite of our desire. A simple example. In the West, people with severe psychological problems are put into mental hospitals, which is pretty radical treatment. Putting someone in jail is wrathful treatment, neither soft nor peaceful. Lama's rule is that mental hospitals are okay, but they should be peaceful, and the patients should be treated with understanding. They should come to understand themselves slowly, not by force. By constraining ourselves with ordination, we can gradually develop our mind. We are not ready for immediate development by forced meditation and so forth. We need to create peaceful conditions for ourselves so that our mind will develop in a certain way and gradually become more stable, not up and down. From there it can be liberated without having to come down into the samsaric world. So ordination is the method of achieving this. Lord Buddha never said we have to follow any rule without knowing its purpose. He said that if you keep this kind of precept, it will give you this kind of mental feeling, safety from certain problems. The 5 precepts are not killing, not lying, not stealing, not becoming intoxicated, and not engaging in sexual misconduct. Lord Buddha never said, don't do these 5 things. Rather, he explained what kind of mind, what kind of confused mental attitude engages in killing and so forth, what kind of selfish motivation causes us to engage in such actions. Before taking the 5 precepts, our mind is dissatisfied, kind of berserk. Lord Buddha said this confused mental attitude brings conflict. If we're in control of our mind, actions such as killing, lying, and so forth never bring the reaction of conflict in our mind. He never said, stop doing that forever. He just said that avoiding it is useful for your mind. When we reach enlightenment, we don't need ordination rules. For example, small children are told not to touch electricity. Their mothers make it a kind of rule against it. But older children don't need such rules, they already know. It's the same thing for the higher consciousness, the liberated, stable consciousness. It doesn't need that rule as it is already free from that condition. If you have an uncontrolled, deluded motivation, do not do such actions. That's all, Lord Buddha said. Ordination is helpful not just because a Lama gives it to us, but because we take it ourselves. If we have great determination, if we understand the nature of the samsaric mind and the way the wrong concept mind reacts and take the ordination with great psychic mental determination, not just ignorantly saying, I want this, but having perfect determination through understanding, then that mental power can lead us in a positive direction for a long time. Samsara comes from the power of the mind, as does the result of liberation. The whole thing is mental attitude. The whole thing is really simple. Lord Buddha also asked, what do we need to be qualified to take ordination? And gave the answer, renunciation of samsara. It's nothing external, such as robes and so forth. However, we all have a different idea of what renunciation is. My connotation is that renunciation is on a mental level. It means not to give something with mental attachment, not to give an object with the mind still in it, such as when we think, I wish I hadn't given that. This way of thinking only gives trouble. We can renounce lunch but still eat it. Renunciation is the mental attitude. It's difficult but possible. It varies from person to person. But some people have very high consciousness. They have control over negativity and problems, and at the same time act in unity with phenomena. But others, when they touch electricity, they get burnt. Similarly, some experience suffering when they can contact the negative mind. We can call it karma, mental reaction, karmic result of action, causation, mental attitude, or movement of the mind. How can we develop our consciousness? If we always put our mind into unconscious situations, we cannot develop higher consciousness. We make it possible by putting our mind into a peaceful atmosphere through ordination. Then we can realize how our mind tricks us. I thought I was like this, but now I see I'm like that. Ordination is like a test. For example, perhaps we have no idea and always think, I am perfect, pure, I don't tell lies. But when we put ourselves into a situation where we are always aware, we realize that our negative mind is very much involved in what we are doing. When we lie, we are trying to change another's mental attitude. Although we don't say the words, I'm always right, our mental attitude says that we are. Until we can trust ourselves, there is no truth at all. For example, we can have an experience, a flash in meditation, but that doesn't mean we have found truth. Also, keeping precepts is basic, fundamental to samadhi meditation, because when we live in ordination, our body, speech, and mind are already in a positive, relaxed atmosphere. Out of this basic atmosphere, we can guide our mind into the peaceful path of liberation. If somebody is agitating us all the time, it's an impossible situation for developing control. Therefore, cut the agitated situation and create the atmosphere you want. I'm not pushing people to take ordination. Pushing people is not the Buddhist way. We don't care if people become Buddhists or not. But those who want to should understand why and how. If you don't want to take precepts, then it's better that you don't. At the end of the course, everyone posed for a group photo. The next day, Rinpoche gave an initiation into the practice of Chenrezig, which was attended by nearly everyone still at Kopan. During the last couple weeks of the course, many of the students had spent their lunch times up in the Gompa, on the Gompa balcony, making Chenrezig satsas for the occasion. Lama Yeshe also offered bodhisattva vows to those who felt ready to take them. At one point during the ceremony, Lama said, "Now after the third repetition, when I click my fingers, think you are receiving the vows," as in a flash of lightning. Just as he snapped his fingers, a great flash of lightning appeared in the sky. One moment it was bright and sunny, the next moment it was dark and pouring rain. Brian Beresford was on the Gompa porch at the time and saw the lightning flash at the very same instant that Lama snapped his fingers. Then it was time for everyone to go home. A New Zealand couple, E.C. and William Hursthouse, had been very deeply moved by the course. When they went to say goodbye to Lama, he confidently declared, "I'll see you again." What? They thought. Where? Zena has visitors at Tubten Choling. Now that he had extra help at Kopan, Lama Yeshe's first task after the fourth course was to visit Zena. But all flights to Phaplu, the closest airport to Jumbese, were fully booked. He had Mummy Max take him to Kathmandu's Tribhuvan Airport at 5 p. Having trouble with one word here. Tribhuvan Airport at 5 for 4 mornings in a row. Finally, he just marched through the lines of waiting people and frightened his way onto the plane. He simply had to see Zena. It had originally been arranged for Zena to spend 1 year in retreat, but now that her time was up, she wanted to stay on. Lama Yeshe and Zena spent a week together at Tubten Choling, during which a solicitous Trulshuk Rinpoche, who knew about Lama Yeshe's weak heart, lent him an horse to get around the steep, rocky countryside. He was astonished to see Lama chose to put Zena on the horse while he walked alongside. At the end of the week, Lama Yeshe returned to Kathmandu alone. Old Nepal hands Tom Laird and Mimi Church decided to visit Jumbese in April. They flew in on the same plane as Bill Barker, Zena's second husband, and Zena's daughter, Rhea. Bill opened up his aluminum trunk and happily showed us a chocolate cake they had brought up for Zena's birthday. Tom Laird recalled. Rhea was the cutest little blonde imp. You could see her mother's earlier beauty in her. She spoke fluent Nepali, and got a porter for us. Bill and Rhea went directly to Tubtan Choling, but Mimi and I stayed in Jumbisi for a few days. There was no tourism up in the mountains then. In the following year, 1974, only 250 trekking permits were issued for the whole of Solukhumbu. By 1996, 25,000 permits were issued. We were among just 100 people who trekked in during that spring season, and Zina was of about only 20 Westerners who have ever lived in such a remote part of Nepal. Jumbisi to Tubtan Choling is only a 40-minute walk, but we had a Sherpa guide lead us through a deep, dark forest on the way. That entire forest is gone now. We walked through a wild valley alongside a rushing river with irises growing all along the banks and stones carved with mantras everywhere. We thought we were in Shangri-La. We could see Tubtan Choling in the distance. The guide led us there around the back way, right past the filthy, stinking toilets. We stood on the north slope of this steep valley and saw a group of monks standing around these toilets. One of them, a big white monk, really stood out. There was no way of telling that he was actually a woman, let alone a famous beauty of my generation. When we went over, the entire monastery came out to have a look at us. Zina invited us into her little house. Her main room was 6 feet by 12, with space to sleep and an altar with pictures of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, water bowls and all other traditional things. Paintings covered the walls and ceiling, and she had a little window facing south. When we mentioned we'd arrived on the same plane with Bill, she said, "He brought me this stupid chocolate cake. I haven't touched it. You can eat it. I came all the way up here to get away from the West, and he brings me a chocolate cake." It was like, how dare he? She didn't want anything to do with it. All her food came directly from Trulshik Rinpoche's own kitchen. He was taking great care of her. I learned later that he was rigorous about the cleanliness of his food, the purity of his water, milk, and butter. I asked her how she was able to receive teachings from him since there were no translators and she spoke no Tibetan. "I'm in telepathic communication with him," she said. Mimi and I exchanged looks and thought to ourselves she'd been here too long. But her relationship with her teachers really was straight from the heart. Visitors were not that welcome at Tubtan Choling, but Rhea soon had the run of the place. She used to dash into the room with this wild grin on her face and dash out again. Bill had just dropped her and the cake off and left. We only stayed for a few hours, and then we went back to Jumbisi. Chris Kolb also called on Zina again on his way up to Laudo. This time he was traveling alone. Chris was a tough guy, unafraid of isolation or physical discomfort, which was perhaps a result of his American Indian heritage. I noticed Zina was much calmer and clearer. She was able to walk in the mountain meadows looking at wildflowers with real delight, something she had never been seen to do before. I complimented her on that and also told her how much clearer I thought her writings were. I moved in for a few days with her and Rhea. We talked Dharma for close to 16 hours a day. A Western monk whom I knew was living in a tent nearby, but we didn't see much of him. Zina told me she thought I had a karmic connection with Trulshik Rinpoche. Before I left, she cooked me lunch, recounted Chris. On the path, Chris ran into another American, Stephen Levy. They had never met before, but Chris suggested Stephen to also pay Zina a visit. "I went to see this Trulshik Rinpoche guy," said Stephen. "He was a big, heavy-set lama who never smiled at me once, just grunted a few times. I realized I was in the presence of spiritual royalty. A nun showed me to Zina's little white stone house. Zina offered me tea and said she was going back into retreat at 5 p.m. that afternoon, so I was probably the last Westerner she was going to see for some time. She talked and was so strange and wonderful. Her house was a little gem of a place. It had a small walled garden and was very well decorated with interesting rugs and little objects around. She told me to go find Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa and said that they would teach me anything I needed to know. At 4:30 that afternoon, I left her and set out walking again. It was getting close to the very end of trekking season and starting to turn cold. When Stephen left Zena and Tubten Choling, he headed toward Lukla, Namche Bazaar, and Laudo, which Chris had also told him to visit. After returning from his visit to Zena, Lam immediately got ready to travel to Dharamsala. With great excitement, he held up some bags of cheesies, most likely brought by Max from the commissary, and said to Anna, "Look, I'm going to offer these to my guru, Ling Rinpoche." "Come on, Lama, you're not really going to offer him that plastic junk food," Anne said. But Lama Yeshe turned on her and snapped. "What do you know? You can offer anything and everything to your guru all the time. This is how you do it." He made her pick up all the bags and hold them up as an offering, while visualizing herself as Vajrasattva and the cheesies as glorious Amrita, the nectar of the gods. The Tibetan cook sniggered in the background. "What are you laughing at?" bellowed Lama Yeshe. He made the cook do the same. Renovating the Tushita Retreat Center. At Tushita in Dharamsala, Peter Kedge had never worked so hard in his life. The day after the Kopan Christmas Puja, he flew from Kathmandu to Bhairahawar, near the Nepal-Indian border, in a DC-3, crossed the Indian border at Sunali by rickshaw, and took bus to Gorakhpur. It was freezing cold. He then got another bus to Lucknow, a train to Chakibank, renamed Pathankot Cantonment in 2013. Another rickshaw to Pathankot, a bus to Dharamsala, and finally the bus to McLeod-Ganj, where he arrived late one evening and had to make his way up the hill to Tushita through heavy snow. The whole journey took about 3 days. It was quite a daunting trip, Peter said. He was greeted by Jampa Zangpo, Tushita's first manager, who left soon after. Over the course of the next 6 months, using Tibetan and Indian masons, carpenters, plumbers, and electricians, Peter managed to replace the entire slate roof, building retaining walls, paint the walls of every room, lay water pipes, and install toilets. While doing all this, he also did the shopping, cooking, served the retreaters already accommodated there, cleaned the place, and managed the workers who arrived every morning. Building supplies were very difficult to come by, Peter recalled. Cement was especially precious, and one usually had to travel to either Pentecote or Kangra, or both were some hours away, then bring it back to McLeod-Ganj either by truck or on the top of a bus. From McLeod-Ganj, it had to be carried by donkey train up to Tushita. A husband and wife team came to cut down some of the deodar pine trees on the property, and over the course of 4 or 5 days, they sawed all the lumber into lengths we then had carried down the hill to a sawmill by porters to be cut to size. Afterward, the planks had to be carried back up to Tushita. A small, wiry man called Chunda Ram came each day with one small axe, a sledgehammer, and some chisels. He'd chop down a big oak tree and have the whole thing split into firewood within a few days. All I ever saw him eat were the 3 small chapatis he brought with him wrapped in a piece of cloth. I marveled at the skills of the people who worked with us in those days. The stonecutters showed up with only hammers and chisels, but from the big boulders on the place, they made beautiful piles of stones of equal size, ready for use. There was another man, a gardener at His Holiness's place, who lived in a nearby village and often passed through Tushita's property on his way home. He offered to sell us some plants, swearing on his honor they were not from the palace gardens. One of the workers who stood out was a young woman called Sarin Samcho, who carried her crippled mother around Dharamsala on her back. While working on road gangs, Saring had carried away enough stones to build her own house, but after she'd been at Tushita for several months, she fell ill with tuberculosis. We bought injections and vitamins and treated her at Tushita. I had never given injections before, but became quite good at it, and after some time she recovered completely. Tushita was truly a place for retreat, with Ling Rinpoche and Geshe Rabten as neighbors, and other Geshis engaged in retreats for years at a time, living on the property itself. These yogis, for that's what they truly were, came to collect water from the tap near the kitchen. Others came to visit or make puja. It was Lama Yeshe's foresight to provide such a facility where teachings could be internalized, and this remains true even today. Rinpoche has said that many of us have received more teachings and initiations than most Geshis in Tibet ever did. What we need is to do retreat in order to integrate and internalize all that we have been given. This is the essential purpose of Tushita Retreat Center. One of my duties as manager, Peter continued, was to ensure that everyone on the property was doing proper retreat. Lama Yeshe insisted I go around to everyone, both the Westerners and these great Tibetan yogis with a register. I was supposed to ask them what the subject of their retreat was and to explain that they were not allowed to go down to town to do pujas. I felt rather awkward doing this, but all the yogis were extremely kind. They took my queries very seriously and told me they were meditating on the Lamrim. Marcel Bertels had arrived from Bodh Gaya at the end of January and was in solitary retreat, having decided to try to achieve single-pointed concentration. In hindsight, he later realized he was not at all ready for such an endeavor. Later in the year, Lama visited Marcel in retreat. Marcel couldn't recall the details of the instructions Lama gave him, but he remembers one particular piece of advice. From time to time, when you meditate on the meditation object, make it smaller and smaller until it disappears. Then sleep on that instead of sleeping in an ordinary way. Marcel tried to follow this advice as best he could for some time, but after experiencing no success, he quite soon went back to the ordinary way of sleeping. I am sure Lama had done many retreats, recounted Marcel, but he regularly referred to what I assumed had been a longish retreat in which he developed deep realizations. I had the distinct impression that this had taken place in India, not long after he left Buxa, but before meeting Zina. Lama spoke about how he liked to do his own cooking rather than have someone come in and cook for him. He said that after living in silence for many months, having to speak again and make human sound had felt gross and uncomfortable. In comparison, silence was blissful. He told me about going for a walk during one of his retreats and coming to a poor farmhouse. By means of gestures, the elderly Indian couple living there invited him to have lunch. From Lama's recounting of this story, I could really feel how touched and pleased he was by this simple and sincere offering. Peter recalled, I hadn't discussed finances with Lama at all. Of course, the income from those engaging in retreat was certainly not enough to cover replacing the roof, building toilets, bringing in water, and building yet another retaining wall to stop the front garden from sliding away in the monsoon. I was constantly under the impression Lama Yeshe was going to arrive at any moment, so I borrowed money wherever I could, having spent all of mine. First I borrowed from Marcel, who was in long retreat. I used to pass his food through a small hatch into his room, and then I borrowed from others. Finally, I took a loan from Ling Rinpoche's manager, who was happy to extend credit on the basis of Lama Yeshe's imminent arrival. This went on for 3 months. I had to go back to Ling Rinpoche's manager several times for more. It was incredibly stressful. One day I found I only had 2 rupees left and nobody else to borrow from. I spent those rupees on a bus ticket to Dharamsala, and at the State Bank of India found that my good friend Harvey Horrocks had sent me $150 from Australia. It was always a struggle, but somehow it always worked. One day, when Peter was just about at the end of his tether, he received a telegram from Lama Yeshe that read, "You come a long way, baby, but you still got a long way to go." Lama had adapted this expression from a well-known advertisement for Virginia Slims cigarettes. In later years, Lama would often simply utter, "Long way, baby," implying the rest. The telegram was a huge relief, and Peter recalled that That telegram was a huge relief, Peter recalled. I knew then, as I had experienced before with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, that Lama Yeshe knew exactly what I was going through, even though he was in Nepal at the time. Eventually, Lama arrived with Max and everything got taken care of. One of the first things Lama and Peter did was go down to the courts in Lower Dharamsala on May 14th and create a trust deed which assumed the ownership of Tushita. Lama had his own lawyer there, an elderly man called Mehta Kishore Chand, a true gentleman of the old school who was Kiplingsesque in his black linen coat and stiff collar, said Peter. He lived in a bungalow opposite the courts and always asked us to join him there for tea after doing business. Later, as centers developed around the world, Lama always insisted they be structured in a manner that ensured they would outlast both himself and Rinpoche, as well as any other individuals. Lama was always encouraging us to think far into the future, beyond ourselves. He had tremendous concern for the Mount Everest Center School at Kopan. During those early days, whatever offerings Lama or Rinpoche received were gathered and put in an account designated by Lama for the support of Mount Everest Center. Neither Lama nor Rinpoche personally owned anything. Suzanne Lee. Suzanne Lee had attended the third Kopan meditation course and wanted more. I wanted to be like Lama Yeshe. I was so mentally scattered, I thought that if I took robes like his, I'd be able to focus on a subject below the surface and tap into the potential of my own heart. I went to see him and said I'd like to become a nun. Oh, that's just another trip, isn't it? He said. It's just another costume for you. You go away and check your motivation for 6 months. Really check. Why can't you practice out of robes? What do you think the benefit of robes is? I shaved my head anyway and went back to the UK to visit my family. They were horrified at my appearance and made me wear little hats all the time, but I really did examine why I wanted to be a nun. When I returned to Nepal, I told Lama I was now 100% sure it was the way for me and asked if he would ordain me. He said he'd take me to his teacher, Geshe Rabten, in Dharamsala. We went there together in May. I helped out around Tushita for a while and met Geshe Rabten. Everyone used to call him the enlightened truck driver because he was so earthy. They called some yogis down from the mountains, and so I was ordained as Jampa Chosam. I felt so fresh and alive that day. Tears just poured down my face. Back in Nepal, I stayed at Kopan for a while, but when more and more people started to appear, I decided I needed a bit more of solitude. I found a little hermitage about an hour's walk from Swayambhu and made myself a home there doing a retreat, seeing nobody and only going out to buy food. Out of the blue, a message came from Lama Yeshe asking me to come to Kopan and give a talk. Oh dear, I really wasn't into public talks, and besides, I didn't think I knew anything. I decided he could find someone who knew more than I did. Then another message came. Lama Yeshe wants you to give a public talk this Sunday. I still didn't go, but when a third message arrived, I knew I couldn't ignore him any longer. I dragged myself away and went up to Kopan to see him. Next Sunday, you give a talk, he ordered. I started to say I didn't know anything, but he was not to be deterred and repeated the order. I ended up giving the talk that Sunday. I spoke about the life I'd led before becoming a nun. I was convinced I'd made an awful job of it and was determined to never give another talk. But when it was over, Lama said, "You give another talk next week." I tried to explain how I felt, but he repeated the order. I just said I didn't want to be a hypocrite and left. As I was going downstairs to sit in the Gompa, something suddenly happened to my eyes. I couldn't see a thing. They were streaming with tears, and I was in such pain I couldn't open them. I had to ask someone to help me back upstairs to Lama Yeshe's room. "What's happening to me?" I asked him. "This is what happens when you go against my protectors," he said. I was devastated. What did this mean? I went to see Lama Zopa, who told me to leave Kopan and go stay with Geshe Rabten, that it was more beneficial for me in India. When I told Lama Yeshe what Rinpoche suggested, he said, "Okay, good, good." Over the next few days, my eyes slowly got better, and the following week I went to Dharamsala. I slowly came to realize just how egotistical I was, and my sole reaction to Lama Yeshe's request had been to think only of myself. Lama didn't cause that eye problem. Nothing outside oneself causes anything. But I was afraid of his protectors, that's for sure. I became close to Lama Zopa and told him I hoped Lama Yeshe would forgive me for going against him. Rinpoche told me, "Just circumambulate holy objects with a big chocolate cake." In later years, another dedicated student also experienced eye problems. Lama Yeshe said this was the result of meditating too externally, of not bringing the practice deep inside the mind where the changes were needed. Heli Pelez, ordained. Heli Pelez had been profoundly affected by Lama Zopa's teachings at the 3rd and 4th courses and was thinking of becoming a nun. One day when Lama Yeshe had left for Tushita Retreat Center in Dharamsala, she sat down before Lama Zopa without uttering a single word. After a while, he simply said, "Yes, we can do." Heli went immediately to Dharamsala, climbing the hill to Tushita in driving rain. Lama Yeshe was in his room with Suzanne Lee, who had been ordained that morning. I was totally soaked, so Lama gave me this red wool dress to wear. I was finally able to tell him I wanted to become a nun, said Heli. "Oh, very good, Lama said. And from that moment on, he took care of all the arrangements. He took me to Geshe Rabten, lent me money, and bought my robes. On May 20th, I was ordained and received the name Jampa Choki. Afterward, he put me on a bus with another young woman whom he asked to look after me. I went back to Kapan and then on to Laudo. Chris and Barbara Voce. After the 3rd course, Lama had asked the Swiss architect Chris Vaudier if he would come to Tushita after Tibetan New Year to help build some retreat huts. So after their Vipassana retreat, Chris and Barbara gradually made their way to Dharamsala. Expecting Lama to arrive in March, they had to wait until May for him. Barbara remembered some A-frame houses she'd seen in Northern California, and when Chris suggested building this style of hut, Lama readily accepted. Lama couldn't read building plans, so I made him a model A-frame and told him what materials would need, recalled Chris. That's when I had an argument with him. He told me to cut down just any tree, but I said I preferred to buy the wood we needed from a lumber mill. These trees are straight enough, was Lama's view. We did end up cutting down some trees, but during the summer the green wood shrank and we had to reline the huts. Lama also wanted these little houses to have Western toilets. I explained they needed running water in order to work. I had some difficulty working out how much I could resist my guru, but he was insistent that he wanted a comfortable Western look. We ended up putting in little toilets, which were very expensive. Glass was also very expensive up there. Lama wanted the whole front wall of the A-frames made of glass. He said the houses should be uplifting, but as I would be concerned, they would become hot boxes. I also built a stone house there for Piero and Claudio, which they paid for. It was shaped like a dorje, with 2 rooms coming off of a central kitchen. Just how many flushing toilets in tourist hotels, embassies, and some Western-style houses in India had Lama seen? Not many, but clearly he wanted his Western students to have modern amenities, no matter what the cost. Lama was never impressed with hippie dreams of roughing it. Simply being in India was generally rough enough. While Chris walked around outside with Lama Yeshe, Barbara wrestled with the mud stove in Tushita's dark kitchen. When Lama cooked, he could get the stove to do things no one else could, Barbara recalled. He'd get flames roaring out of every opening and could crank an amazing amount of heat out of it, but nothing ever got burnt. The regular cook could never get anywhere near as much heat out of the stove. Lama helped me wash the lettuce and spinach. He was meticulous, carefully and gently washing every leaf perfectly. I'm the impatient type. Every 3rd leaf was good enough for me, but not for Lama. Of course he was looking for tiny insects and grubs that might get killed. One day he suddenly banned me from the kitchen. I was debilitated from hepatitis and very thin and weak. He just said, "You go out from there." There was no money around then, and the food was absolutely minimal, right down to eating rice with boiled fern fronds. One night, Philip Camus, who had sponsored the Laudo Roof, came to dinner. Lama cooked that night. No one could work out where all the food came from, as we simply didn't have that amount of food. Yet every time we turned around, Lama came out of the kitchen with another full pot, offering everyone more and more food. Right at the end, he produced a big bowl of strawberries, which were extremely rare up there. He took them over to Philippe and said, "Eat this. This is my blood." Another day, I walked into the dining room to find him wearing a red woolen woman's dress someone had left behind. It had a zipper up the back, a tapered waist, long sleeves, and a long skirt. It actually fit him rather nicely. "This is very good quality, dear. No point in wasting," he told me. The message I got was that everything is useful and we shouldn't let our preconceptions get in the way. One time, Chozum Wong, half-sister to Lama's half-siblings, who he called Achela, or elder sister, came to visit him there. They laughed all night long. The next day I said something to him about how happy he must have been to see her. He just snorted and said, "My sister, your sister." It was as if he was saying, "Don't get caught up in such things." Another day, a student from New York came to see him and smoked a cigarette in front of him. I was shocked and said, "Lama, he doesn't know who you are." Lama turned and said, "If anyone asks you who is Tibetan Yeshe, you just tell them if anyone asks you who is Tubten Yeshe, you just tell them Tubten Yeshe is nobody. He is nothing. All my teachings came from Lama like this, in little powerful moments rather than during long courses." Physically, Barbara had become extremely weak. While shopping down in Dharamsala one day, she found herself wishing Lama would show up because he would have the jeep and she could get a lift back up the long, steep hill to Tushita. Suddenly, someone slapped me on the head with a rolled-up newspaper. It was Lama. "The psychic telephone is working very well, dear," he said to me. I was with Suzanne Lee that day, who was about to become ordained, Barbara continued. We mentioned that we'd had an audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama that morning. Lama turned around in the jeep as we drove up the hill, and with the full spread of the Himalayas behind him, beamed at us and said, "You have seen your mother and father." I have never forgotten that moment. Around this time, Geshe Rabten came to visit Tushita Retreat Center, and at Lama's behest, the students chanted the Guru Puja in English, which was the first time this traditional practice had ever been chanted in that language. It really didn't go very well, recalled Barbara. We couldn't figure out how to do it, the tunes, the rhythm, and so forth, but we tried. Pete Northend, a young builder from Leeds, attended that puja and was completely bowled over by his first sight of Lama Yeshe. Pete, who had a great sense of fun and wore his blonde hair quite long, was bursting with energy. When Peter Kedge discovered Pete was a skilled carpenter, he asked for his help. He was such a straight guy, this Peter Kedge, so conservative in his Indian pajama pants and the perfect English manners. "I hadn't seen such a straight guy in years," said Pete Northend. He wasn't that straight. Peter Kedge and Harvey Horrocks had been at Woodstock. He started work immediately with great enthusiasm, helping Chris Vautier build the A-frames and also making a beautiful curved dining table and benches out of deodar pine that had been cut on Tushita's land. He made the table curved so all the people sitting around it could see Lama at the straight end. Pete worked at Tushita until the fall, when at Sister Max's request, he went to help out at Kopan just before the 5th course. Leaving Tushita. Around the end of May, Lama Yeshe and Max left to go back to Nepal. Peter Kedge traveled with them to Pathankot. Max then said to Peter, "Honey, why don't you come down with us to Delhi?" So, Peter recalled, on the spur of the moment, instead of buying the supplies like steel reinforcement rods, porcelain toilet bowls, bathroom fittings, and so forth I had intended to take back up, I went on the train with him to Delhi. We stayed in Connaught Circus at the York Hotel, which was owned by Lama's sister and her husband, Mr. Wong. I wasn't feeling too good, and Max looked at me and said, "Your eyes are yellow. You've got hepatitis." It was blazing hot, and I felt like death, but somehow dragged myself back up to Tushita. When I finally got back, all I could do was lie on Tushita's balcony and look at the view. Tsering Samcho looked after me the whole time. Although it doesn't seem like much money these days, I think the weight of the debt I had racked up contributed to my falling ill. But the other thing I remember is that after almost 3 years in Asia, I'd become overconfident, and one blistering hot day, while looking for cement in Pathankot, I ate an ice cream I'd bought on the street. I was sick for 6 months. I thought I'd never get well. Another trek to Laudo. Lama and Max arrived back at Kopan. Trekking season took the Mount Everest Center monks back up to Laudo. The bigger boys, accompanied by Losang Nima, made the 2-week walk all the way to Laudo from Jiri. The younger ones went by plane and were accompanied by a number of Ingis who had been encouraged to do retreat at Laudo. Among them were Yeshi Kadro, Dick Robinson, and Gareth Sparham, all of whom had done the 3rd and 4th Kopan courses, and Meredith Hassan, who had been at the 4th. Jampa Choki was already there. Since provisions for everyone had to be flown in to one of the Solo Khumbu airstrips, Lukla or Changboshe, and then carried up to Laudo, it was quite an expensive operation. Mummy Max paid for everything for everyone except the Westerners. Nick Ribish was to accompany Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche by plane a couple of days later. Over the course of a week, more than 30 pieces of luggage, drums of food, and other provisions were collected at Max's Rana house, and on the day of departure, ferried by van to Trimbhuvan airport. Included was a large trunk of medicine and other supplies Nick's friends had brought from over before the 4th course. The sky was clearest in the early morning, but by afternoon monsoon clouds had gathered and flights were cancelled. Would-be passengers waited, and in the end nobody flew. When it was obvious there would be no more flights that day, the Lamas went back to Kopan and all the stuff was loaded onto the van and taken back to the Rana house. The next day the same thing happened, so Lama decided that rather than keep ferrying everything back and forth, Nick should stay at the airport with the luggage until they could get a flight. Fortunately, on the 3rd day they flew. Nick took care of bargaining with the Sherpa porters at Lukla, and the trio set off for Namche Bazaar. Lama purposefully led the way. That night, Nick recalled, we stayed at a Sherpa family's house near the foot of the mountain upon which Namche is situated, and the next morning climbed the 3 hours to the town. We had lunch at a restaurant owned by the family of one of the young Kopan monks, Tubten Yeshi, and then set out on an additional 3-hour walk to Laudo. All along the path, surprised and awed Sherpas prostrated made fumbling offerings to one of the great masters of that area, who was, after all, the Laudo Lama. When we got to the foot of the mountain below Laudo, Nick continued, Lama suddenly turned to me and said, "You and Zopa go that way," pointing left to a ridge that gradually ascended to Mende, a small, flat area below the Laudo Gampa. "I'm going this way," and wheeled off to the right. I found out later that the path Lama had chosen was extremely steep. When we got to Mende, Rinpoche's mother and sister were there with incense, katas, and a thermos of hot tea, and we slowly climbed the rest of the path to Laudo. When we arrived, I was surprised to find Lama already sitting comfortably in his room. Nick surmised that as Laudo was Rinpoche's domain, Lama had chosen to arrive quietly the back way, leaving his pupil free to be welcomed with full ceremony without having to defer to his teacher. When Stephen Levy eventually walked into Laudo, we found everyone there jumping with anticipation as Lama Yeshe, and more importantly for the locals, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, the Laudo Lama, were about to arrive. An hour after I got there, Lama Yeshe arrived, laughing and talking to everyone, said Stephen. As he passed me, he brushed my arm with his hand and bowed. He was like an orange gold tornado, and he really did glow. Then he disappeared into his room above the Gompa. I decided I wanted to talk to him, but some other students told me it wasn't possible. I just plunked myself down anyway outside his door and waited for him to come out. As it got darker, I was told I should get going, as it was dangerous to be on the trails at night. But I said no, I'm waiting for Lama Yeshe. Stephen went on. But finally he came out and I talked to him. He suggested that I attend the meditation course in November. Then he asked me if I knew anything about gardening. I really didn't know anything at all, but I said I did. Okay, the course is in November. You come in September and we'll talk. And with that, he whirled away. Now, Chris Kolb's ordination, to which Lama Yeshe had finally agreed, was conducted in May by Trulshik Rinpoche at Tengboche Monastery, where he was visiting, giving initiations, and conducting pujas. A Sherpa shaved my head beforehand with a butter knife sharpened on a stone. It was brutal, said Chris. He received the ordination named Nawan Chodak, and Lama Zopa instructed him to go to Kumjung and seek out Gomchen Kampala. I did retreat at Charok for a couple months and then went. I was the first Westerner Gomchen Kampala had ever seen. Chodak subsequently spent a whole year in the mountains, leaving his pregnant wife behind at Kopan. Lama was only staying at Laudo for a few days. Yeshe Kadro wanted to speak with him. She wanted to do a Torah retreat, but no sadhanas had yet been translated from the Tibetan, and no one could tell her what to do. Lama was seeing people around the clock, so she waited outside his room from early morning until late that night. It was around midnight when I finally got to talk to him, said Yeshe Kadro. He spent 2 hours explaining how to set up the retreat, and then told me he was leaving Laudo at 5 a.m. Suddenly word arrived that Rinpoche's mother, who lived nearby at Thangme, had fallen ill. There and then Lama Yeshe decided to make a mad dash through the night, detouring to see her en route to the Lukla airfield. It was always an emotional event when the lamas left to go away, and this new drama found everyone unprepared. As Lama Yeshe turned to go, one of the little monks charged at him, bearing his head in Lama's chest and sobbing. "Now, who is this?" said Lama gently, taking the little face in his hands. Only after everyone had settled down again could he leave. Rinpoche's mother recovered. The day Lama Yeshe returned to Kathmandu, Pasang Sering arrived in Nepal. That very afternoon, Mummy Max bought him a sleep. That very afternoon, Mummy Max bought him a sleeping bag and a seat on a charter flight that left the next day for Lukla, from where he could join the boys at Laudo. There he quickly established himself as a strict disciplinarian. One day I was sitting waiting for patients in the upstairs room of the Laudo Gompa that Yeshe Kadro and I had set up as a medical clinic when there was a terrible commotion in the classroom next door, recalled Nick. The next thing I knew, a crying Charak Lama came in, his shirt off and angry red mala bead marks all down his back. I don't know what he'd done, but Lama Pasang certainly didn't like it. I rubbed some ointment into his wounds and sent him back in. Holiday and Mussoorie and Chopal recruited. When Lama Zopa came down from the mountain a week or so later, Lama Yeshe wanted to take him away for a month to give them a break from the incessant demands of an increasing number of students and the growing responsibilities at Kopan. Mummy Max rented a house for them in Mussoorie in the Indian Himalayas, in an idyllic town known for its scenic beauty and peaceful atmosphere. When we got there, Lama didn't like the house because it was on the damp side of the hill, so we moved to a big new concrete hotel on the dry side, said Max. I rented a car and we drove around a lot because Lama thought it might be a good idea to buy land around there. We also made a trip to Palampur and walked around the land that had originally been offered to the Tibetans. Lama talked about starting up a mushroom farm. He was always thinking of ways to support Kopan, but nothing came of that particular idea. While they were in the area, Lama Yeshe called in on his old friend Chopal, both known by both Tibetans and Westerners as Chombe, who was now living in Simla with a wife, 3 small children, and a nice little business. "Come and cook for us at Kopan," Lama Yeshe asked him. "I will look after your family for you." Chombe was feeling guilty. The last time he had seen Lama Yeshe was when he had left Buksa to be ordained as a Gelong and vowed with the text on his head that he would return one day. Instead, he had disrobed, married, and had children. Now my guru was asking me to do something and I couldn't refuse him. The only way I could purify that bad karma I had created was to follow him, said Chombe. He gave up his business and moved to Kopan with his family. Philippe and Linda Camus were living further up the mountains in Manali and invited Lama Yeshe to visit. Philippe was an unconventional fellow, as was his cousin Francois, who was staying with them at the time. "We were sitting around chatting in the garden," said Francois Camus. "Lama Yeshe was talking to Philippe with his back to me, and I was thinking, this is a man in authority. I don't like authority." Then in a flash he turned around and looked into me so deeply no words can describe it, but he said nothing. When Lama Yeshe eventually returned in July, accompanied by Rinpoche and Max, Peter recounted, he sat with me in the evenings while I lay sick, and I remember him saying to me on one such occasion, "It's so sad the way in samsara everything is impermanent and everything changes." Lama spent a lot of time with me through that period. That year was the happiest of my life. The air was pristine and the view over the rolling foothills of the Himalayas was spectacular. The best time that year was in the winter when most of the Tibetan community left to sell sweaters on the plains. Retreaters stopped coming and the mountain was quiet and still. Although I didn't have time to study at the Tibetan library as most of the other Westerners did, and didn't have much time to meditate, still my mind was light and exhilarated. Lama Yeshe's room at the left front corner of the building was quite large. It was always littered with projects, papers, and open texts. Rinpoche's, on the other hand, was the rather small room at the right front corner of the building. While Lama was always busy, Rinpoche generally spent his time sitting perfectly still. The largest room in the house, across the front corridor from Lama's, was used as a gompa where everyone gathered on the prescribed days every month to chant pujas together. Jampa Zangpo was back at Tushita, and Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche invited the young Canadian monk to join them in a monsoon retreat. They both sat on the window seat in Lama's big room, said Jampa. I sat on the floor and watched Lama Zopa. He'd pick up his offering bowl and hold it up in the air with his arm rigid. With his other hand he reached into the bowl to take a little nectar on his fingertip, then rubbed it on his forehead. He did this repeatedly as if in a trance. Lama Yeshe and I exchanged glances, but he seemed very happy about the whole thing. Rinpoche was just in another world. Tushita was not the only place in Dharamsala where Westerners came to study the Dharma. As Peter mentioned, further down the hill at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, Geshe Nawan Dargay was giving regular teachings. These were attended by Glenn Mullen, John Landau, Jim Doherty, Stephen Batchelor, Brian Beresford, Alex Berzin, and a host of others, and soon they were joined by a young woman from the United States named Feather Meston. Olivia de Hulville also turned up. She and Feather had much to share as they both had young children, even though Heather had a small son, she was thinking of becoming a nun. Olivia told Feather that her own son Michael was living at Kopan. When Feather asked Geshe Dargye about wanting to become ordained, he told her she must first ask permission of both her husband and her son. A few days later, bearing a jar of honey as a gift, Feather met Lama Yeshe. He was sitting inside one of the newly completed A-frames. "Come in and sit down, dear," he said. She did, and while Lama sat in complete silence with his eyes rolled back into his head, finally he opened them, looked at her, and said, "Yes?" She told him all her troubles with her eccentric husband, her small son, about wanting to renounce drugs, wanting to have an affair with another man, and wanting to renounce it all and become a nun. Lama didn't respond for some time. He rolled his eyes back again and then told her, "I have a nun meditating in the mountains of Nepal. You are going to be like her. Go slowly with your husband. Women go faster than men, but men are more stable. Be kind. Don't shock him. Use more wisdom and less emotion, dear." Feather had never heard anyone talk that way before. "When I walked out of that A-frame, my feet seemed to be not touching the ground. I have never experienced such a feeling of floating before or since, not even on acid," she said. The meeting left her feeling considerably calmer and more clear-headed. A few days later, she returned to her husband and asked permission to build an A-frame on Tushita land. When she told Lama Yeshe, he took her by the hand and said, "Oh yes, dear." She was stunned. She never imagined a lama would even touch a woman, let alone her hand so warmly and comfortably. Her husband Lawrence, who was also an artist, painted a mural depicting the four harmonious friends on the wall of the front porch at Tushita to the right of the main door. At the same time, William, the Dutch artist who had painted the walls of Lado Gompa the year before, arrived at Tushita and began painting a mural of Shakyamuni Buddha on the front wall to the left of the main door, while a nun called Ani Jampa painted deities on the walls of Lama Yeshe's big room. Lama Zopa Rinpoche later painted the face of Shakyamuni Buddha in the wall mural. Later in the year, Wim also painted a vibrant, wrathful Yama, the Lord of Death, on the doors of the Kopan Gampa. Around this time, the Indian government decided to conduct a visa purge. Citizens from the Commonwealth countries had previously been able to remain in India indefinitely, but now required visas. In the case of the other Europeans and Americans, requirements were tightened. Many of the young Westerners who had been hanging around McLeod Ganj for as long as they could, legally or illegally, were thrown out. Marcel returned to Nepal. The Vaudiers went back to Switzerland. Feather, Lawrence, and several of the other Americans studying at the library decided to go to Kapan for the 5th meditation course. Among them was Jim Doherty, the American football player. He had met Chris Kolb at Tengboche just before Chris's ordination and had subsequently gone to Dharamsala to study. They eventually grew to be great friends. Zina Rachevsky dies. Kumjung, where Rinpoche had sent me to find Gomchen La, is in the last wave of mountains before Everest, Choda recalled. During the monsoon, the mornings are usually clear, but then it rains solidly for the rest of the day. The first 3 days I was there, it rained nonstop, and when the sun broke through, there was a huge rainbow in front of an extraordinary sunset of glowing fire. I fed 2 crows there, and they talked to me. Whenever someone was coming along the path, they'd land on my roof with a big thud. Later in the year, Wim also painted a vibrant, wrathful Yama, the Lord of Death, on the doors of the Kopan Gampa. Zina Rachevsky dies. Kumjung, where Rinpoche had sent me to find Gomchen La, is in the last wave of mountains before Mount Everest, Chodak recalled. During the monsoon, the mornings are usually clear, but then it rains solidly for the rest of the day. The first 3 days I was there, it rained nonstop, and when the sun broke through, there was a huge rainbow in front of an extraordinary sunset of glowing fire. I fed 2 crows there, and they talked to me. Whenever someone was coming along the path, they'd land on my roof with a big thud to let me know. They were right every time. One day, the crows started making a big fuss on the roof. I looked down the valley, and in the distance I could see Trilshik Rinpoche coming along with his entourage. The Sherpas burnt piles of fragrant juniper all along the way, and you could hear his deep puja voice reverberating for miles. When he arrived, his attendant told me I had to speak to him. By then I could speak just enough Tibetan to get by. Rinpoche took me by the arm and told me a runner had come up from Tubten Choling to Tengoche to tell him Zina had died 3 days ago. He said he had known she was dead before the runner came. He told me that he was getting up on the first morning of those 3 days of endless rain. He was meant to read the text for that day, but then changed his plans and decided to meditate instead. He said to me, I stayed in my room and meditated all day, all that night, all the next day and night, and all the next day as well. At sunset on the 3rd day, I stopped. Then he looked me in the eye and told me he had done Poa for Zina and transferred her consciousness. He said the signs were good, the sky auspicious, and the weather had broken to reveal double rainbows. However, he was worried about Rhea, who was still in Tubten Choling. He said she was a very special girl, and he wanted me to get down to Tubten Choling as soon as possible before they sent someone to take her away. Zina had died just at the time of that incredible sunset, pink-tinged neon turquoise over white snow peaks. I'll never forget that sunset. Trilshik Rinpoche said Lama Yeshe had told him Zina would die soon, and that she was the cooperative cause for the existence of Kopan and his whole trip of teaching Westerners. I ran all the way down to Tubten Choling all night along the black, narrow paths. I even hired a Sherpa to carry my pack. It took me 2.5 days, but I didn't get there in time. I walked into Jumbisi the day after Zina had been cremated. Jumbisi. Trilshik Rinpoche didn't want to kidnap Rhea. He just wanted to see her and talk to her guardian, Conrad Rooks, Zina's ex-husband. Conrad Rooks, Zina's ex-husband, was in Kathmandu, having recently finished making the movie Siddhartha, so he came up and took her away. Mummy Max had passed him a message that had been sent to Kopan saying Zina was seriously ill, and she was dead by the time he arrived. There were all sorts of rumors as to the cause of Zina's death. It was reported that her stomach had swollen up like a basketball. She had had terrible cramps and was no longer able to fold her legs, but had sat with them stretched out in front while she continued reciting mantras until she died. Some said her illness lasted 5 days, and on the morning of the 5th day she had sat up, announced she was going to die, and then resumed saying mantras. There were rumors she had been poisoned by a primitive Sherpa tribe that believed it was possible to take over another person's power by killing them. Apparently the previous incarnation of the young Kopan Tulku, Gelek Gyatso, who had lived in the Jumbisi area of Solu, was thought to have died that way. Others said she had inadvertently poisoned herself by mistaking a local poisonous bulb for garlic, and that she had died of amoebic dysentery. That she had died from eating another poisonous plant, datura, that she had died from untreated appendicitis. Clive Gabor was in his Kathmandu apartment when General Kiran, who had rented his house to Zina's mother, telephoned on an army radio. He told me he had been radioed from Solu with the news that Zina was dead. He didn't know who to contact, so he called me, said Clive. At the time, Harriet, Zina's mother, was in New York with Rhea's Aunt Louise. Zina's death was very traumatic for Rhea, who went to the United States soon afterward. All her grandmother's family were devout Catholics, so she was subsequently raised Catholic. Years later, she showed a friend of mine a charming little storybook her mother had written and drawn for her, but she was not prepared to talk about her mother's death at all. She isn't at all involved with Buddhist things. Rhea and some nuns were present when Zena's head nodded forward and her consciousness left her body. It was said later that Rhea told Clive Giboire, Mummy sat back and stopped counting prayers. Rhea had just turned 8. Piero Cherry was in with Lama Yeshe in Tushita Retreat Center when Lama said to him, Zena is dying now. Lama went immediately into meditation. He told Piero later that he had transferred Zena's consciousness to Vajrayogini's Pure Land. When a runner from Tubten Choling arrived at Kopan with the news, Mummy Max immediately sent a telegram to Lama Yeshe at Tushita Retreat Center. One morning, a runner came up to the house from the postal and telegraph office in Lower Dharamsala, said Peter Kedge. He was carrying a telegram from Nepal addressed to Lama Yeshe. I took the telegram to Lama, who wouldn't take it from me. Not even looking at me, he said, open it and read it without emotion. I opened the telegram and read it to Lama. The news was that Zena had passed away in the mountains, but clearly Lama was already full aware of that fact. Lama Yeshe went to a nearby nunnery where prayers were said for Zena throughout the day. When he returned that evening, he was radiating energy. He told Massimo Zena had visited him in a dream the night before she died, saying she was going away and asking for his help. Her last letter to the Lamas had just arrived at Tushita, and it was unsigned. Zena had kept a journal in which her daily practice schedule was written out through mid-September. The last journey was made on August 18th, the writing weak and barely legible. Most likely date of her death appears to be the 20th of August, 1973. Only Mummy Max and Losang Yima were at Kopan when the news arrived. On Lama's instructions, Max sent Losang Yima up to Tubten Choling, but once again the weather was bad and his flight was delayed. He missed Zena's cremation, which is held one day after her death, but he did gather some more news. It seems Zena had suffered uncontrollable diarrhea and vomiting for several days. The day she died, she was unable even to drink tea. She had said she knew she would die that day and had reached out and taken Rhea's hand. The monastery had organized her cremation, and many prayers were said for her fortunate rebirth. Her more valuable possessions were given to Conrad Rooks, and the rest distributed among the community, her robes going to the other nuns, as was the custom. Less than a year after her death, Tom Laird, who had visited Zena in April together with his friend Mimi, was back at Tubten Choling and asked Tulshik Rinpoche what had happened to Zena. This time there was a translator, said Tom. He told us Zena had a very good death, that she had died in meditation, and her daughter had been there and had lit her funeral pyre. I also heard that a doctor at the Hillary Hospital at Paplu had tested her fecal matter and said she had died of cholera. Indeed, there had been a cholera outbreak in that valley during that summer, and several people had died. Lama Zopa Rinpoche said Zena knew she was going to die, that the signs in the weather during her cremation were very good, and Tulshik Rinpoche had said she was in Vajrayogini's Pure Land. Sometime after this, Zopa Rinpoche asked Zong Rinpoche where Zena had taken rebirth. Zong Rinpoche also said Zena had been reborn in a Pure Land. A visit with Lama. John Landau, who had seen Lama Yeshe only once in Bodh in early 1971, arrived at Tushita for an interview with him. That meeting in Tushita was very important to me, John related many years later, because it convinced me the powerful impression I had had of Lama when I first arrived in India had not been a fluke, the product perhaps of a romantic infatuation. If it had been a figment of my imagination 2.5 years previously, then here I was imagining it again. We talked politely for a while, then Lama stood up on his bed, held my hand in his, and right before my eyes, his face suddenly transformed. As you can see in photos of him, Lama's face was noticeably asymmetrical, but now it became perfectly symmetrical, making me think of the Buddha image hanging on the wall of my room. As this was happening, I felt as though he was pouring something into me. The whole experience was overwhelming. I stepped outside and was greeted by a huge orange sun sitting poised on the western horizon, reminding me of Amitabha Buddha. As if floating on air, I somehow made my way down the hill to McLeod Ganj. Partway down the hill, I had a strange encounter. Turning a corner of the path, I came across a little house where some Tibetans lived. Standing outside was a very beautiful young Tibetan woman who smiled enticingly at me and beckoned me to come inside. I thought it strange, but as if under a spell, I stepped toward the gate to follow her. Several Lhasa Apso dogs came charging out, yapping at me noisily until an old crony suddenly appeared and chased them away. Once inside, the young woman pointed to a faded old tanka hanging there, indicating she wanted to sell it. I wasn't interested in it, so I said goodbye and continued on my way. After I left, I was struck by the thought that perhaps this surreal, dreamlike episode hadn't actually happened at all. Afterward, every time I went up to Tushita, I kept my eyes peeled, but I never saw that young woman or the crony again. I still do not fully understand what happened to me that day, but it seemed to have something to do with having just visited Lama Yeshe and having entered, however briefly, into his magical space. Lama Yeshe had certain unusual qualities I also noticed about His Holiness the Dalai Lama. For example, there were occasions when both of them seemed to change size. Sometimes they might appear rather small, while at other times they seemed huge. It was as if their true essence, their essential being, was formless and their physical body was just an afterthought, something they manifested for our sake. They often appeared to be more fluid than solid. Return to Laudo. Pasang Sering was sick the day Lama Yeshe arrived back at Laudo. Lama looked him over and said, "You are not really sick, your mind is sick." The next day he was hale and hearty again. "My guru came, so I got better," he told Anala Ann. Pasang Sering and Lumdrup Rigsel were quickly renamed Lama Pasang and Lama Lundrup by the Ingis. As with Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, only Tibetans ever used their full names. By the age of 7, Michael Loseng Yeshe was already an old Laudo hand. The food there was very poor, Michael recounted. We ate only tsampa with hot water and a few watery vegetables and potatoes. The locals made cheng, so there were barrels of sweet fermented grain mash around. I ate handfuls of it until Lama Zopa discovered what I was doing. Of course, it was alcoholic. Once my mother came up and made a puja offering. She gave every child a piece of cheese, but they took one bite and threw it away. They didn't know what cheese made from cow's milk was, said Michael. Cheese from the milk of a dree, a female yak, is an entirely different thing and is usually eaten dried. When it was time to go back down to the valley again, Lama Yeshe walked out with Anala Ann, the artist Wim, and a number of boys who had newly enrolled in Mount Everest Center. One of these was Tubten Monlam, whose mother had worked on the construction of the Laudo Gompa. I was excited and a bit scared, but I knew all the boys who were going, so it wasn't too bad, he said. Also among the new boys was a young Sherpa Tulko, Tenzin Norbu, from Namche Bazaar, who had been enthroned that summer at Laudo. He had been given the name Tubten Zopa Rinpoche, so everyone called him Tubten Zopa Small. Charak Lama, Tenzin Dorji Rinpoche from Thangme, and Gelik Gyatso from Paplu, who came to be known as Lama Babu, were the other two young Sherpa Tulkus among Mount Everest Center students. Anna Ann says, "We started walking out in the middle of the night. Halfway down the hill, we were met by Sherpa families offering tea and more little boys ready to join the school. It took us almost a day to get to Lukla. You can only walk along those paths in single file and have to keep a sharp eye out for falling rocks, loose gravel, and precarious edges. I was about 50 yards behind Lama and Wim, who were talking together. I presumed they were talking about Dharma, so I got really sulky because I loved it when Lama talked about Dharma. All we ever seemed to talk about was money, building projects, or the weather. I'd been asking him to tell us something about the Kalachakra empowerment the Dalai Lama was going to give in Bodh Gaya the next January. Everyone at Kopan was planning to go, so there I was sulking away when suddenly Lama stopped and called back to me. "What did you say?" So I caught up with him and I said I wanted to join in the Dharma conversation too. He gave me a great big golden smile and started talking about Kalachakra. By the time we got to Lukla, we had collected 10 more kids. It was clear the plane we had booked was not going to be big enough, and also that it would be well nigh impossible to get another. Everything was the usual chaos at the airstrip. There were tents all over the place and big European tour groups waiting for charters. The RNAC, or Royal Nepal Airlines Corporation, office was like a campaign tent. Lama and I went in there to see if they had a bigger plane. They didn't. We were stuck with the little 7-seat Pilatus Porter plane we had ordered. Lama gathered the little boys around him and tried to convince the RNAC people we could fit them all in because they were so tiny, and they didn't buy it. Then a 21-seat Twin Otter arrived. I happened to get a look at the way bill for the packages on it. It said Annapurna Tours. Then one of the staff lost the waybill and they couldn't work out whose plane it was. I whispered to Lama, "It's Annapurna Tours plane, but they can't prove it." "Then we'll take it," he said. He went straight over to the counter, slapped a pile of money down and said, "I'll take that charter. You don't know whose it is and I have the money for it right here, so give it to me." The plane was out there revving its engines ready to take off. Not knowing what else to do, the guy at the counter took Lama's money and it was our plane. The staff looked worried, but Lama just waved a receipt at them. We ended up with more seats than we needed, so I had great fun yelling out from the plane steps to the hippies trying to get down to the valley. 200 rupees a seat, who wants to go down? When the plane landed in Kathmandu, Lama got out and walked calmly across the tarmac with all these red-robed kids following behind like little chickens. The men from Annapurna Tours couldn't believe their eyes. "This is our charter. What are you doing on our plane?" But Lama just waved his papers and said, "I paid for that plane," and walked right on in. He really had some nerve. Mount Everest Center at Kopan. There were now 30 small monks at Kopan. "Oh dear," thought Mummy Max, "how am I going to pay for all this?" She bought them toothbrushes, soap, and towels, none of which they had ever seen before or even heard of. Then they all got sick because of the bacteria at lower altitudes. The Sherpa boys were a grubby little bunch, accustomed to defecating on open ground. The kind of personal hygiene Westerners took for granted was completely foreign to them. "Oh, Lord," thought Max again, "they're all going to die. Their parents will go berserk and we'll all end up in jail." But they soon got better. At meals, the boys all sat on the floor, so I had tables and benches made for them. I even bought tablecloths which lasted exactly 1 day, she said. Ever since the Chinese takeover of Tibet, there had been nowhere for Nepal's Sherpas and other Himalayan peoples who were primarily Buddhist to educate their children within their own spiritual tradition. Word of Mount Everest Center spread fast. Parents turned up from all over Nepal, eager to enroll their sons. Although the mountaineer Sir Edmund Hillary had already built around 24 fine schools in Solukhumbu, they were focused on a primarily Western secular model of reading, writing, and arithmetic. For many Sherpas and other Himalayan ethnic groups, it was vital that their sons and later their daughters receive a traditional monastic education. Lama Yeshe's educational design was also ensured that all the monks at Mount Everest Center had an opportunity to help with building construction, gardening, cooking in the kitchen, and administrative duties in the office. Westerners staying at Kopan were asked to teach the monks English, which would be a passport to an altogether new life. As a result, they gained a well-rounded education. For the boys, mealtimes were special times with Lama. He patrolled up and down their neat little rows of tables and benches in the dining room during almost every meal, barking orders at the cooks and treating the children like royalty. The food was very plain. Then again at bedtime he did the rounds, making sure they were all tucked in and their increasingly cramped rooms kept clean and orderly. If their rooms were messy, the boys had to tidy them. "Lama is Tara," said the boys, possibly referring to the maternal nature of Lama's attentions. The female Buddha, Tara, is often referred to as the mother of all Buddhas. The three little Rinpoches slept in a room together and had a few small privileges, such as being exempt from having to prepare the vegetables in the kitchen or to do certain other chores. Some Western students told their parents all about the little monks. Suitcases of red and yellow t-shirts, socks and sweaters lovingly knit by mothers and grandmothers began to arrive. Work at Kopan. Before going to Kopan as suggested, Stephen Levy had called to see Lama Yeshe at Tushita in August to make sure Lama was still wanted a gardener. He reached under his little meditation table and pulled out a garden trowel, Stephen recalled. "You know how to use this? We'll talk more when you come to Nepal," he said. I was amazed he even remembered me. When I got to the monastery, Yeshe Kadra was in the office. I told her that Lama had told me to come, but I didn't have any money. She told me I had to work for my keep and could sleep in the storeroom. It was pretty awful. Then Lama showed up. Every day Max returned from Kathmandu with her jeep full of plants. When Lama came downstairs after breakfast, he was all business. It was always, "What are you doing? Why did you do that? Where are Mummy's plants? Where do you think this one should go? What about this tree? Lama is busy now. See you later." I'd be left wandering around trying to work out where to put things. I'd dig a hole and then he would suddenly show up again, demanding, "You think this is a good place? Are you sure?" The minute he said that, I'd say, "Well," and he'd immediately jump on me. "You're not sure. When you are sure, Lama will come back." Every time I planted something, he'd ask if I was sure. When I said I was, he'd say, "But are you sure you are sure?" And we'd both crack up laughing. That laugh of Lama's was so infectious. It was like sonar, laser. I'd like to have a tape of Lama's laugh to listen to forever. But he was heavy, too. I would dig a dozen holes for some plants. "Why are you putting that plant there?" I'd remind him that some hours earlier we had both agreed on the spot. "Do you think Lama doesn't know what he said? Put the plant over here." I'd move it back and forth, and then he'd want it back in the original position. It seemed like he was testing me, seeing how far he could push me. He'd say, "Let's dig here." I'd say, "No, I'll dig that." And he'd give me a firm, loving shove with his shoulder, grab the shovel and say, "No, Lama will dig." I was 32 years old and he was only 6 years older, but he was like a father or even a grandfather. I felt like a child. He was ageless. His male mothering fed so many neglected, untouched, unloved places within me. Anna Ann watched how Lama interacted with everyone. He climbed into our skins to find out what made us tick and mimicked our body language and mannerisms. He was just hilarious. If I was unhappy and feeling low, he'd find a way to make me feel valued. When he had fixed me up, he'd turn to the next needy person and maybe do exactly the same thing with them, while I was still there. He'd flick an eye over at me to make sure I was getting it. Lama was just as skillful in showing us our negative traits as our positive qualities. He seemed to know intuitively when people were arriving and what happened to them. I read his mail for him, and he often knew what it contained before being told, or he'd say to me, "Marcel is here. I can always tell when Marcel is here. I'd look out the window, and there would be Marcel coming out of his retreat hut. Magic is the only word I have for it. Another example. We were always late getting to the airport with no time to spare. At all. The other cars having gone already, and Lama not quite ready every time. Finally, Lama would climb into the rotten little Nepalese taxi, while the driver pumped the ignition, but it wouldn't start. Lama couldn't drive at all, but he'd lean over and turn the key, and it would start right up, every time. "Okay, let's go," he said, precluding any kind of conversation about what he'd just done. Lama also kept his eye on the money and gave Yeshi Kadro the job of accountant. He was very astute, she remembered. He checked every transaction. When the tiny building I used as an office was pulled down and Peter Northend began building a big new kitchen dining room complex in 1974, it was assumed the larger of the two spare rooms would be the office. But no, Lama said it had to become a coffee shop. Shops make money, he told us, not offices. And Lama Yeshi needed money. How else was he going to feed and support the growing number of young monks? Money was always a big subject. Once when Anna La'an and Lama Lundrup were greeting Lama Yeshi at Kathmandu airport, some American tourists came over and took their photos. Then they admired the Lama's malas. "They aren't for sale, are they?" They most certainly were, and an excellent price was obtained. While they were haggling, however, Anna La'an drifted out of sight. She was sentimentally attached to her mala and had no intention of selling it. Lama Pasang took care of all the shopping with Kopan's food and supplies in Kathmandu. Trained in the ways of the books and markets, he always drove a hard bargain. He loaded everything onto a rickshaw and took it to the house Mummy Max was renting, not far from the royal palace, where it was all loaded into her jeep for transport up to Kopan. Lama Pasang had a favorite rickshaw boy, Kancha, a 14-year-old Nepali orphan who was desperately poor. Lama Pasang soon brought Kancha up to Kopan, where he began working as a kitchen boy. Kancha was very intelligent. He soon began learning how to read Tibetan and could eventually be found sitting on his bed in the kitchen storeroom, reciting prayers in Tibetan from his prayer book. Lama Yeshi regularly conducted thorough inspections of everything in the kitchen. He checked the hygiene, tasted the food to make sure it was not too spicy or greasy for the young monks, and occasionally whacked Chombi with a stick. Chombi didn't mind. It was the Tibetan way. The standard Nepalese meal of dal bhat was often augmented by Tibetan momos, steamed, not fried. Lama Yeshi wouldn't let the cooks fry them. Too greasy, he said. He also insisted the monks be served a salad every day. Fresh salad was not part of the Tibetan diet, but was something Lama had picked up from the Ingis. "Bake brown bread rolls," Lama told Chombi. "Ingis think brown bread is much better than white." Chombi did as he was told, but he also noticed the white bread rolls always disappeared first. "They don't always do as they say, you know," he told Lama. The quality of food at Kopan varied greatly during the year according to what vegetables and other foods were available. During monsoon season, only cauliflower, Swiss chard, and potatoes were available for everyone. Almost from Kopan's inception, Lama Yeshi's faithful friend, Chaukidhar, quietly and tactfully smoothed out many a local dispute, including one involving access to the spring at the bottom of the hill. Among Nepalis, springs were considered to be sacred Hindu sites. Sometimes angry Nepali women threw water at the hippie Inji girls who splashed about immodestly. In Nepal, every spring is regarded by both Hindus and Buddhists as under the control of serpent-like beings called Nagas, and such disrespectful behavior is regarded as both offensive and highly inappropriate. Lama scolded Chaukidhar all the time, recalled Peter Kedge. Every morning, Chaukidhar came to Kopan bringing fresh buffalo milk for Lama. He was always dressed in exactly the same clothes and had this extraordinary weather-beaten face. Lama would harangue him in a bit of Hindi and a bit of Nepali, all mixed together, and Chow Kidhar would just smile and quietly respond. The more Lama shouted and yelled at Chow Kidhar, the more the old man smiled. Lama often told his students, "We don't know who has realizations and who doesn't," adding that maybe Chow Kidhar had higher realizations than Lama himself had. Lama was always sending Chow Kidhar off to scout for new pieces of land to buy. Lama was buying up every Ropani he could get, and it was Chow Kidhar's job to discover who was willing to sell. Most of the plots were very small. Chow Kidhar would come back with a price, and Lama would say it was too much and send him back to try again. Chow Kidhar set off again with a smile. Their exchanges always ended with the two of them sauntering off arm in arm to inspect the vegetable gardens. One of Lama's running jokes with Chow Kidhar was that he would bring him up to Kopan one day, shave his head, and make him a monk. The fifth Kopan meditation course. Kopan was preparing for the fifth course, which began on November 16th. Again, the number of those enrolled almost doubled over the attendance of the previous course. Once it became clear that nearly 200 people would be attending and would never fit into the gompa, a huge tent with burlap walls, a straw floor covered in new jute mats, and a tall wooden teaching throne was erected behind the gompa. Mummy Max bought hundreds of yards of colored bunting, and the tent was decorated with tonkas and flowers. Lama Yeshe ran around in an old, worn-out shemtab, directing everything and everybody. Chombe ran the smoke-blackened kitchen, stirring his great pots in two enormous mud and stone wood burning stoves. Out shopping in Kathmandu one day, Lama Yeshe felt a tug on his robe. Once again, there behind him was Geshe Lama Kunchog. He had left his cave in the remote area of Tsum, close to the Tibetan border, and had suddenly shown up in the capital city. Lama took Geshe-la back to Kopan, where they debated Dharma until 3 a.m. "We never talked about ordinary things," said Geshe Konsog. "When we debated, we never thought about food or drink or noticed the time passing. It was just as if we were back in Tibet. Lama Yeshe told me that he would build me a house at Kopan one day." Some years later, Tempa Choden, one of the Mount Everest Center monks, was present when Lama Yeshe asked Geshe Lama Kunchog if he would come and teach at Kopan. "Geshe-la didn't answer," said Tempa Choden. That autumn, a BBC film crew turned up wanting to feature Western hippies in a documentary about Buddhism in Nepal, the title of which was to be The Roaring Silence. Lama Yeshe wasn't interested. Neither he nor Zopa Rinpoche appeared in it, but Anil An, Nick Ribish, Yeshe Kadro, and some other students did. During the summer in Laudo, Nick had decided he wanted to become a monk. While there, he had even gone so far as to buy the robes of a deceased nun. When he returned to Kopan and told Lama Yeshe of his wish, Lama fell about on his bed laughing, but eventually said, "Okay, we think about." Yeshe Kadro offered to move out of their shared room, but Lama told her to stay. "I was a bit shocked," she said, "but I learned later that if you separate before you are really ready to do so, attachment lingers." Continuing to live with each other in celibacy meant it became a very natural and complete separation. I didn't have time to think about getting ordained myself because I was too busy in the office. While in Laudo, Nick had come down with hepatitis. I'd made the mistake of smoking a farewell joint with some jaundiced Australian friends 6 weeks earlier, just before leaving for the mountains, he said. I thought they were post-infectious. They weren't. So while Yeshe Kadro, Nick, Gareth, Dick, and his girlfriend Meredith and the others went over to the Gompa to do their various jobs, running the clinic, teaching the boys English, doing maintenance work, and so forth, I had to stay home at the Genupa Hermitage, about 50 minutes away. I'd brought Brian Beresford's fourth course notes with me and had my own notes from the third and fourth courses as well. So during the couple of months of my convalescence, I edited them into a commentary to the wish-fulfilling Golden Sun. It was doing this work, especially Rinpoche's teachings on the perfect human rebirth, that made me want to become a monk. I also realized that by simply taking notes, we were missing so much of what Rinpoche was teaching. So I decided that at the next course, the fifth, I would take down every word. When it began, I plonked myself right down in front of the throne and proceeded to write down every word in my best medical scrawl, making up abbreviations as I went along. The amazing thing is that afterward, Yeshe Kadro could read it better than I could and was able to type up a 400-page manuscript, which I then edited. We published this and the commentary I'd edited at Laudo early the next year. All this was pretty much the beginning of publishing in the FPMT and the forerunner of both Wisdom Publications and the Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive. Right through the fifth course, Nick and Yeshe Kadro rose at dawn every day and took the 8 Mahayana precepts. They spent the rest of every day working hard. Then every night, after Lama had dined with Mummy Max, they attended a staff meeting called by Lama at around 10 o'clock. After that, they went to bed, and then pretty soon it was time to get up and take precepts again. Everyone sat in the big tent before the teaching throne and altars built of wonderfully draped packing cases. It looked just beautiful. Rinpoche began his first teaching in this way. I don't have any experience, realizations. I don't know anything about Dharma. But maybe the Dharma recognizes and knows me well. My understanding of Dharma is like one atom of this universe. Therefore, I don't have any hope that this meditation course can benefit you. But I'm happy to talk about a new subject with a new mind. A new subject and a new thought. As you and I are human beings for such a short time, I think it is fortunate to talk about such a holy thing. Lama Yeshe asked John Landau to lead a discussion group. It was John's first Kopan course, but he had been studying with Geshe Nauman Dargye at the Tibetan Library in Dharamsala for some time, and Lama thought that gave him some background to help out a bit with the new students. I felt unqualified to answer anyone's questions, but was unable to refuse Lama's request. People started telling me all this personal stuff about their lives and wanted me to say something helpful, but what did I know? So I took a break from myself and just focused my mind on Lama Yeshe really strongly. I asked for inspiration, and beneficial responses just came to me. That was really my first teaching from him. I didn't see very much of him during that course, but over the next 10 years, while preparing his teachings for publication, I remembered the experience and tried my best to get out of the way and allow him to speak through me. Some people had extraordinary personal relationships with Lama Yeshe. Ken Meese, an American college graduate in psychology, and a friend were making their first trip to Kopan. Lama Yeshe sent Anna Ann down to meet them. He said he had been waiting and watching for us for days, recalled Ken. We got the information about enrolling in the course. Then he asked if I would visit him daily to talk about psychology. I agreed and worked out an outline of topics in response to his many questions. He was particularly interested in depression and psychosis, which he had observed among some of his Western students. He told me some had attempted suicide, and he was surprised at the listless doldrums in which so many young Western people seemed to live. I told him I was interested in learning to meditate so I could spend 7 years in a cave, but he just laughed at me. I also asked him about the Christian imagery that kept entering my meditations. I wondered what I could do about this distraction. Lama looked at me for a moment and then burst out laughing, rocking about and holding his sides. I felt rather ashamed. Then he stopped, glared at me, and said in a slow, measured voice, punctuating every word, You Americans are so stupid. You come here halfway around the world to have a spiritual experience. Then, when you have one, you call it a distraction. Many are running away from their homes and religious traditions, so we teach them Dharma. When they are not so attached, they can go home and be Christians and Jews again. You cannot be a Buddhist while running away from home. Negative attachment is still attachment. The young English woman who had become fixated on Rinpoche continued to be a problem during the course. Her behavior became increasingly unpredictable. Once she burst into Lama Zopa's room and took her clothes off. He responded by pouring water over her. Another time, while Rinpoche was sitting on the floor in front of his teaching throne, leading the 200 students in meditation, she climbed up and sat on it, a breach of etiquette that shocked everybody except Rinpoche. Finally, Lama Yeshe banned her from Kopan, an order she ignored. Her disruptive behavior continued. One day, when she was raging around the place, Lama Yeshe instructed Anna Land to make her leave. "Hit her with a stick," he shouted from his balcony. The only stick at hand was a 6-foot plank. As Anne grabbed one end of it, the English girl grabbed the other end, and a tug-of-war ensued. Anne was worried. She didn't want to hurt her. But Lama Yeshe looked down on the scene and roared with laughter. He laughed and laughed and laughed, that special cosmic laughter that had affected so many people at Kopan and elsewhere. Under the spell of this extraordinary sound, the disturbed young woman suddenly dropped the wood and quietly walked off down the hill. She later reappeared when Ken Meese and Lama Yeshe were having one of their psychology classes. Suddenly, she was upstairs on the flat roof, crying and howling. Ken recalled, "It was obvious she was a soul in deep distress. Lama Yeshe jumped up and asked me to go with him to deal with her. He bent over her, saying nothing, his face full of concern. When he had her full attention, he thanked her for being there. 'She is here to help me,' he told me. 'She is here out of compassion.' When she began to wail and weep again, collapsed in a heap on the floor, Lama said to her, 'Thank you for being here and for helping me. You have come to take all my sufferings upon yourself. Thank you, thank you, thank you.' He kept this up for a good 10 minutes. Then, as if to convince her his suffering had really been removed, he began to appear more and more joyful until he was dancing around her. She continued to howl, though occasionally she looked up through her tears at Lama cavorting. Gradually she began to quieten. As she calmed down, so did he, all the while giving her full credit for his happiness. 'You have such compassion,' he told her. 'I am healed. My suffering is gone. You have taken it away.' There was no trace of condescension or irony. He appeared to be genuinely grateful. Eventually she wiped her face and thanked him too. Then she got up and left. I told him I thought he had healed her. My joy in being relieved of suffering was her joy as well, he replied. Lama Yeshe was very interested in the talking cures of psychotherapy, particularly in how this might work for suicidal people. He said performing pujas for them wasn't enough. He was intrigued by Jung's archetypal psychology and how people might cross the cultural divide between East and West. He was very interested in the theory that a splitting taking place in the psyche during early childhood might explain the development of psychosis in later life. Despite Lama's ministrations, the English girl had not recovered. Once more, when she was shrieking and yelling around the hill, Lama Yeshe ordered a bucket of water be found for her, tossed over her. She instantly went limp and quietly returned to Buddha. Not long after, Lama Yeshe told Ken Meese it was time for him to go home. He was kicking me out. The next day I went to him at our regular hour and he told me. I already had a guru, that Jesus was my guru. 'Look,' he said, and pulled the robe away from his neck to reveal a small gold cross on a chain. See, I am also a Christian, he said. During our remaining classes, he asked me to teach him about Christianity, which I did, using Carl Jung's book, Answer to Job, as my inspiration. Lama also told me he could remember something of his 6 previous incarnations. He explained these were not normal memories but had come to him in meditation. I also know about your previous lives. Do you want to know? He asked me. I told him I didn't. At our last meeting, he told me to never stop meditating, stressing that he felt the main problem for Christians and Jews in the West was that they were not taught to meditate. When people teach doctrines, remember always that every doctrine was at one time someone's direct experience of the truth. So always check up what you are told or hear through your own meditation, he warned me. During the second 2 weeks of the course, the students took the 8 Mahayana precepts before dawn every day and kept silence until lunchtime. Steaming mugs of soy coffee or tea were served after the first dawn time session of the day. By lunchtime, everyone was starving, ate huge amounts, and then tried to take a nap for an hour on their bedrolls. Afternoon tea and supper each consisted of another mug of tea. One day, Lama Yeshe decided the students needed a treat, so he cooked macaroni and cheese for lunch using ingredients Mummy Max had bought at the commissary. Chombe and Kancha were both on hand to help, but Lama chose the recipe and stirred the pot, Max tying an apron around him so he wouldn't mess his robes up. He served the dish himself, fussing over everyone, the consummate host. Pete Northend, the builder from Leeds, was also participating in that course. Pete was the cheerful type and made friends easily. Early on in the course, he noticed a young man who seemed to be having problems adjusting. Suddenly, this young man was gone, leaving his passport and money behind in the office. He had told others he was hitchhiking to England. Pete decided to tell the Lamas about it. Well, when I told them, they just rolled around on the carpet laughing, Pete recounted. They asked me if I intended to search the Himalayas for him, and then said the best thing I could do was to go back to the tent and learn to meditate. They said not to worry, because during the session they would do a puja for him. It would pick him up from wherever he was, bring him back to Kopan, and place him right under the Bodhi tree. So I went back to the tent and sat there listening to the Lamas ringing their bells, chanting and stuff. When I walked outside at the end, there was the guy sitting under the tree, under the Bodhi tree. What's more, he was covered in wet mud while Kopan was as dry as dust. It hadn't rained for ages. I asked him where he had been and how he had got there. He said he didn't know, so I told him to go upstairs and see the Lamas. A short time afterward he left again, this time with his passport and money. I never could bring myself to ask the Lamas what they had done. It was all too much for me. The time had come for Lama Yeshe to come and give a talk for those doing the course. He was to give refuge and precepts on December 6th, so on the previous day he gave a preliminary talk about them to everyone. He's not like Rinpoche, the old hands told the new ones. He makes you laugh, makes you feel like you can do anything, that you're wonderful and definitely going to become enlightened, rather than remaining absolutely hopeless and going straight to hell. Lama Yeshe entered the tent in his best robes. As he climbed up onto the throne, he snapped his finger and thumb, a customary gesture. Once a teacher is seated, it is usual for those attending the teaching to respectfully prostrate 3 times. To some, this final snap seemed a rather haughty signal to everyone to make their prostrations. Lama Yeshe later explained his finger snap was actually a special prayer. I am not a throne lama, so this is not my place. So I snapped to remember impermanence, he said. It's an antidote to pride. His talk had its usual effect. Everyone relaxed, cried with laughter, forgot for a time their anxieties and sorrows, and felt inspired to practice Dharma, to be of infinite service to others until the day they died. And all this took place while Lama Yeshe, in his unique brand of English, was saying things never heard before, such as your berserky mind freak out. Many European students who were there also spoke little English, but everyone could understand Lama Yeshe. Later they discussed his talk among themselves. Some had heard one thing emphasized, others had heard something else. Anna Leanne told me that some people wanted to take refuge in the 5 precepts, but before doing so, it's necessary to understand why you're doing so, how to do so, and what the benefits are. That's very important. If you don't know all this, your practice becomes less powerful and you can start to have doubts about it rather than feeling comfortable with it. You need to know what you are doing, therefore I'm going to give you a short introduction. Actually, I don't need to tell you much because you've had teachings on refuge and karma during the course, and in meditation have already checked beyond the words. This is actually the perfect introduction. Taking refuge means having a continuously enthusiastic feeling for discovering the pure energy and omniscient wisdom that we call Buddha. It doesn't really matter what we call it. There are so many words. Actually, it means perfect wisdom, understanding wisdom, and how seeking this is beneficial for our life rather than living with the empty, cold feelings that we often experience. Taking refuge brings a warm feeling into our heart and the continuous wish to grow and develop instead of thinking, "Oh, I'm hopeless, I can't do anything," the kind of thinking that brings you down. By discovering, as Lama Zopa has been telling you, that human ability is great and wanting to make the most of the opportunity of being human is wonderful. You have thought about the perfect qualities of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha and realized that you too can acquire those qualities and are no longer under the illusion that Buddha and Jesus Christ are way up there in the sky somewhere and you are down here, nothing. Thinking that you are nothing, that you're just like an animal, is totally the wrong way to think. You're putting yourself down, completely underestimating your ability. You have the incredible potential to develop in exactly the same way that Lord Buddha and Jesus did. They both appeared on earth and passed away. Their physical atoms don't exist here anymore, do they? But even today, we still enjoy their wisdom, light, power, and compassion. When Lord Buddha was here, his body was not an ordinary body. Through the power of his bodhicitta, to use Buddhist terminology, whenever people saw his body, they gained higher realizations, such as a single pointed concentration. But when he was finished on the physical level, his knowledge, the power of his wisdom, lived on such that we can still feel it today. This is the result of the wisdom and true compassion of his bodhicitta mind. So I'm saying that discovering that you have the ability to, or potential to develop that within you, that you can grow continuously without stopping, no matter what happens to your physical body, your mind can be completely relaxed. Even though you get old, changing on the mental level, you can continuously develop and better understand your own nature, and no matter that the external world goes up and down, your internal world is always supported by your understanding. You are supported by your wisdom in the middle way rather than falling this way or that. We talk about eternal happiness, eternal bliss, eternal joy. These qualities last forever, unlike the momentary, transient pleasures of samsara, and they arise from knowledge, wisdom. So taking refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha means you are taking refuge in Lord Buddha's ultimate wisdom, true compassion, and everlasting bliss. Think what a fantastic state of mind that is. Just imagining it brings you energy. I mean, you haven't yet attained it, but just visualizing that omniscient mind, thinking about it, brings its reflection into your mind. You feel more peaceful and relaxed. A sensation of happiness comes into your mind, a warm feeling, a really warm feeling. By discovering that such qualities lie within you makes you also respect other sentient beings' abilities and stops you from putting them down too. You can't do anything, you're hopeless. That's not right. By discovering your own abilities, you respect others and generate warm feelings toward them rather than hatred. It's so simple. Lama Yeshe's words had the power to change people's lives, among them Dieter Kretzer's. I sat throughout his talk in full lotus posture, Dieter explained. This was something I have never been able to do until then. I closed my eyes, and during the whole 2 hours of that talk, I just trembled and cried. Come on, Dieter, I told myself. You're German, male, rational, not a slave to your emotions. But I couldn't stop. Afterward, I made an appointment to see Lama. He told me, I have a feeling we have known each other before sometime in the past. At the next teaching, I not only sat without any pain in my legs at all, but for the very first time I understood every word Lama Zopa was saying. It was all absolutely crystal clear. Another highlight of Lama Yeshe's talks was question and answer time. Some students liked to ask complex questions, designed perhaps to parade their intellectual skills. Lama Yeshe's answers always seemed tailored to each type of person. First he listened with eyes closed, rocking slowly back and forth. Then came a period of intense silence. When he finally answered, the words seemed to come from somewhere deep, very deep within him. They cut sharply through cleverness, encouraged the timid, and exposed logical flaws. Many people tried to nail Lama with Western science, but he always won, and in the simplest language which everyone could understand. The fifth course ended on December 14th with Bodhisattva vows from Lama Yeshe, a celebratory puja and an initiation into the thousand-armed aspect of Chenrezig. This included commitment to recite one mala of the long Chenrezig mantra, approximately 140 syllables, daily, but this little detail was communicated only at the end of the initiation. Shocked, some students complained to Lama Yeshe, claiming it took too long to say the mantra and they had been tricked into making the commitment. A little reluctantly, Lama gave them permission to say the short 6-syllable mantra instead, Om Mani Padme Hum. At the conclusion of the course, some students wanted nothing more than to run down the hill as fast as they could back to Kathmandu and the nearest chillum of hash. Others desired a hot bath, a steak, and a soft, comfortable bed. Back to the real world. Where on earth had they been? The month at Copan seemed to vanish like a dream. As usual, a few students left the course expressing varying degrees of disappointment and possible fear about what it meant to live one's life the way Rinpoche recommended. Still others felt so inspired and grateful after the course that all they wanted was to stay at Copan, to continue studying with like-minded people, work around the place, and help out. There were many students who seemed to find something new and precious in their lives during their time at Copan. One such student was the son of a foreign diplomat living in Kathmandu. My mother was a very sick alcoholic. I went to see Lama Yeshe and told him how I sometimes concentrated all my energy on the whiskey glass in her hand, praying for it to shatter. You can't do that, he said, and laughed his famous laugh. He invited my mother up to Copan after the course. She came up with her driver, and Lama took her into his room. Half an hour later, she emerged in floods of tears. That night, she barricaded herself in the kitchen and drank, but after that, she slowed down and within a few years stopped drinking altogether. I never knew what they talked about that day, what he had said to her, but she always had great respect for Lama Yeshe and for my Buddhist practice, he said. Tom Victor, Nick Ribish's friend from Australia, who had been at the 4th course with his wife Kathy, returned a little before the 5th course. Tom and Kathy lived in a geodesic dome they had built on their farm in Mooloolah, Queensland. So now Tom and Pete Northend built a small dome just below Lama's room and the Sangha houses. Lama then sent Tom to Tushita to do a short retreat, after which he traveled with Peter Kedge to Bodh Gaya for the Kalachakra in January. While there, he invited Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa Rinpoche to Queensland to give a 4-week course later in the year. "Sure," Lama said. "Just send me a ticket." Ordination plans. For the little monks of Mount Everest Center, the mob of crazy Ingis was the dream. For them, life at Kopan returned to normal when the course ended and most of the Westerners left in mid-December. December weather in the Kathmandu Valley is generally cold, clear, and windy. Perfect for flying kites, a very popular pastime among children in Nepal, and especially boys. The Kopan monks often scampered up the Gompa steps and jumped off the high retaining walls at the side of the building, their zens held out like sails. The wind caught them, buoying them up in the air for a little. Seconds later, shrieking with glee, they crashed into the ground. Coming from the high Himalayas, most of these children were born to cold and wind. After the 5th Kopan meditation course, several Western students were seriously thinking about taking ordination, among them Marcel Bertels, who had been in silent retreat for months. Then there were Dr. Nick, Yeshe Kadro, and Ursula Bernis. New Yorker Linda Grossman had attended some of Lama Yeshe's 1970-71 talks on Wednesdays and Sundays, and then returned for the 5th course. Now she wanted to become a nun. 19-year-old Deborah Livingston, known as Spring, also wanted to be a nun, as did Feather Meston. When Nicole Couture added her name to the list, Lama Yeshe told her, "You have been a nun a long time in your heart." Nawan Chodak had come down from the mountains where he had made friends with Jim Doherty. Jim had decided he too wanted to become a monk. I hadn't spoken with Lama Yeshe before this, but I had written down everything I wanted to discuss with him. I'd weighed up all the pros and cons until I was absolutely sure the only way I could live my life was as a monk. I was a bit worried about money, but Lama mentioned something about benefactors, which sounded encouraging. I ended up going to a special meeting he held for those who wanted to be ordained. Finally, there was Gareth Sparham, who had attended 3rd, 4th, and 5th meditation courses, and spent the summer teaching the young monks English and doing retreat at Laudo. He also wanted to take ordination, so now they were a group of 10. Lama Yeshe gathered these prospective monks and nuns in his room together with 5 or 6 of his students who were already ordained, and talked frankly with them about the nature of monastic ordination, its importance, and how to support one another. Just because you are a monk or nun does not mean that you have reached enlightenment. It simply means that you have gained an understanding of the nature of samsara and have decided to work continuously to develop within yourself the everlasting peaceful path of liberation. That's all. The Sangha had much support in Tibet. For us, it's not like that. We have to take more responsibility for ourselves. We need to somehow put our Western lifestyle and Dharma together. If you need coffee, have coffee. If you need cake, maybe eat cake. You have certain habits, a particular heritage. You have been raised in a particular way. We can't tell you to eat only sampa, drink only Tibetan tea. You don't need such external changes. You don't need to be focused on cutting out various kinds of food, giving up things that you are used to. Renunciation should be more in the mind than on the physical level. I want to give up my wallet. Please, somebody take it. Thinking that way just makes things more difficult, dear. We have to introduce some kind of discipline when creating a Sangha community. For example, when you become a monk or nun, you're not allowed to stay in situations that are too samsaric, such as places where there's lots of dancing and drinking. Bringing your deluded mind to samsaric places is like bringing a piece of paper close to a fire. Lama demonstrates this by bringing a piece of paper closer and closer to the candle on his table until it bursts into flame. You're okay at a distance, but if you get too close to the fire, you'll get burned. Flammable materials should be kept away from fire, and we beginners should stay away from dangerous situations. For us beginners, the desire to attain everlasting peaceful liberation is just like a flower seed. A flower seed needs to be cared for, watered, kept warm, fertilized. Many things are necessary. Water alone is not enough. It needs fertilizer. Similarly, we need Dharma teachings. If we get teachings and retreat, we can wake up fantastically. Enthusiastic energy always comes. Otherwise, we're like flowers that have been given only a few drops of water. When problems arise, we will find it difficult to deal with them. Our minds are just like flowers. We have to take good care of them. My feeling is that it would be much better if the Sangha were to stay together, communicating with each other rather than people getting ordained and then going off on their own. If you go off on your own, worldly conditions will make your life difficult. It will be much harder for you to practice Dharma. Therefore, we need to develop strong togetherness energy instead of allowing the Sangha to split up and go their own way. I think we should create a community specifically for Western Sangha. If monks and nuns have difficulty just keeping their physical lives together, how will they ever get the chance to study and retreat? The strength of the Sangha community is that it ensures that everybody has a chance to take teachings and retreat. It makes sure that everybody is okay and minimizes the external conditions that cause one to lose mental discipline. I think this is really worthwhile. It helps a lot. There's a Sangha vibration, you see. When you look at each other, there's a vibration that automatically helps you control your energy. You should check this for yourselves. But don't think I'm just talking about the 15 of you in this room. You can imagine what's going to happen. Now we have this many Sangha. After the next meditation course, there will be more. Then after the next one, more again. After some time, we might become 100,000 strong. It's possible. The strength of the Sangha community lies in ensuring that everyone is okay and minimizing the external conditions that cause one to lose mental discipline. If you, as Western monks and nuns, have a good attitude, behave well, and develop a strong Sangha community with group togetherness, Western people will respect you. They'll feel that Westerners becoming Sangha is worthwhile. They might even want to help you. You should discuss amongst yourselves how to create strong Sangha togetherness. Don't think that I'm attached to keeping you at Kopan. It doesn't matter to me where you live, as long as you maintain good Sangha togetherness. Think with wisdom and be strong. Having made up her mind, Yeshe Kadro had cut her long hair short, but not shaved. Lama Zopa hung out his window and laughed at me when I walked past. I scribed Lama Yeshe's letters, so I had quite a bit of contact with him. He gave me a bit of a hard time. It's hard to say, but I felt he was pushing me to be more decisive as well as more spontaneous. I had always been the good girl. I also saw Lama give Rinpoche a hard time. Lama Zopa was always sitting on his bed studying or meditating. He sat for so long he got bed sores, and he hardly ever ate anything. He sat at dinner with Lama and Mummy Max, but spent all his time blessing the food instead of eating it. Lama made him get up and go for walks around the hill every evening and scolded him for not eating. These people get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to bring you breakfast. They put hot cereal in front of you, and I come in, and an hour later you're still meditating and you haven't touched it. You're ungrateful. What's more, Lama said it in English so we could all understand it, said Yeshe Kadro. One day, Ursula Bernice was in Lama Zopa's room, Rinpoche's room, working on some translations with him, when Lama Yeshe, wearing heavy hiking boots, burst in and ordered his holiest disciple around in very brisk Tibetan. How can he treat my precious guru like that, thought Ursula. While some students saw Lama as all sweetness and light and regarded Rinpoche as strict and reserved, there were times when their roles reversed, and it was Rinpoche who was all kindness and compassion. while Lama Yeshe was the one manifesting a fierce aspect. But one thing seems certain. Lama Yeshe intended to keep Zopa Rinpoche alive and to protect him in whatever ways were necessary. He knew better than anyone what an incredible practitioner he was. Once after Rinpoche had completed a retreat, Lama said to Max, "Mummy, I think we have a real baby Buddha now."